Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the most eyebrow-raising corners of medieval belief. Those weird, tangled superstitions people had about sex demons and what might be growing inside you if you weren't careful. You're standing at the edge of a smoky, candlelit room, the fire crackling low, the air thick with incense and whispers. Outside, it's the year 1254, and you've just been told that if you so much as think lustful thoughts before bed, a demon might sneak into your room and give you a child. No pressure. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fun to see how far this sleepy little community stretches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lie back on your itchy straw mattress, listening to the chickens shift in their coop just outside the window. You're married, lucky you, but even so, your nightly activities come with a long checklist of spiritual warnings. You see, in the medieval mindset, sex wasn't just a physical act. Oh no, it was a cosmic risk, a spiritual gamble, a potential gateway for demons to slither in literally and metaphorically. Let's start with the stars of tonight's tale, incubi and succubi. These weren't just horror stories whispered at bedtime. These were considered legitimate threats backed by clergy scholars and more than one half-melted saint relic. Incubi were male demons who targeted women in their sleep, while succubi, yep, you guessed it, were female demons who seduced men in their dreams. If you had a particularly intense dream one night and woke up a little sweaty, it wasn't just an embarrassing accident. Nope. You had been visited, violated, and possibly impregnated. That brings us to the children. Oh yes, because if a woman conceived under demonic influence, people believed she might give birth to something not quite right. Maybe it would look human. Maybe it would be hairy, or have hooves, or glowing eyes. Historians still argue whether these stories were metaphorical, literal, or simply a clever way for the church to guilt people into abstinence. One of the more infamous examples came from the 13th century monk Caesarius of Hysteria, who recorded numerous tales of women giving birth to demon spawn after impure dreams or unsanctioned dalliances. Some of these children were supposedly abandoned in the woods, while others were raised in secret, their parents praying daily that their offspring wouldn't sprout bat wings or start speaking in tongues. Honestly, every medieval tantrum must have come with a side eye and a whispered, "Do you think?" But not all of the church's take on sex was demon-tinged doom. Enter the saints, specifically the extremely awkwardly celibate ones. Meet Saint Pelagia, also known as Pelagia the Harlot. Before she converted, she was well known around town. But after seeing the light, and probably realizing how terrible medieval birth control was, she repented, became a nun, and isolated herself in a cave for the rest of her life. Her legend includes stories of burning her luxurious clothes and cutting off her hair, all to escape temptation. Which honestly sounds dramatic until you realize that in medieval Europe, vanity was considered a gateway sin. A plunging neckline might as well light a torch and summon Satan yourself. Then there's Saint Benedict. This poor guy once reportedly threw himself into a thorn bush to discipline his flesh after being tempted by a woman's beauty. A thorn bush. Imagine explaining to your friends why you're covered in scratches. Oh yeah, I saw a pretty ankle, so I yeeted myself into nature's barbed wire. Feeling better now, thanks. And Saint Bernard, of Clairvaux supposedly had such a calming presence that women would go into hysterics just being near him, so he tried to avoid eye contact ever. You walking down the street, make eye contact with Bernard. You high. Bernard dives into nearest monastery wall. These saints weren't alone. There was an entire culture of spiritual self-denial that held up chastity not just as a virtue, but as a kind of divine cheat code. The more you resisted, the more holy you were, which meant that sex, even marital, even scheduled, even candlelit with Gregorian chants, was never fully without sin. Unless, of course, you were trying to make a baby. And even then, there were rules. We'll get to those in a later section. Oh, yes. Now you might be wondering if people feared sex this much, how did anyone have kids? The answer reluctantly, with prayer. And often under the assumption that desire itself was a sign of spiritual weakness. Many medieval thinkers, like good old St. Augustine, believed that original sin had forever corrupted the act. Before Adam and Eve messed things up, humans could have had children without, actually enjoying the process. Afterward, pleasure entered the equation, and with it, guilt. To combat that, people did wild things. Couples would abstain on Sundays, on feast days, during Lent, before communion, after childbirth, and basically anytime the moon looked judgmental. Some records suggest couples ended up with fewer than 100 acceptable nights per year. Imagine trying to plan intimacy around a calendar thicker than your local grimoire. And then there were those who went even further, married couples who chose to live as brother and sister to achieve a more holy life. A few even took vows of celibacy together, which, let's be honest, might have made family reunions less complicated. Still, whispers of demonic offspring and saintly abstinence couldn't entirely suppress the facts of biology. People still got pregnant. People still got tempted. And the medieval imagination did what it always does. It filled in the terrifying, hilarious, and deeply human blanks with stories, legends, and enough scandal to make even a modern gossip blogger blush. So tonight, as you sink deeper into your blanket and the flicker of candlelight fades behind your eyelids, just remember, if you lived back then, your dreams might have gotten you exercised or made you a parent. Sleep tight. The moon is high, peeking through a sliver of animal hide stretched across your tiny window, and your neighbor is praying loudly. Not for rain, not for health, but for the correct lunar alignment to make a baby that won't be cursed, deformed, or worse, a heretic. Welcome to the confusing intersection of medieval astrology and family planning. Back in the Middle Ages, people weren't just checking if the crops had sprouted or if their chickens were still alive. They were checking the sky. Because when it came to sex and conception, timing was everything. And no, not like modern ovulation tracking apps. More like the moon is waning and Venus is rising in Pisces, so tonight we shall abstain, lest the child be born with a tail. You sit beside your spouse on a scratchy straw-stuffed mat, both of you staring out the window at the stars. It's not romantic. It's strategic. You're trying to remember what the town almanac said about Saturn's position, because if you mess this up and conceive at the wrong hour, you might just end up with a child born under the sign of Mars, which means they'll be violent. Or born when Mercury is retrograde. Enjoy your new chronic liar. Astrology books of the time were filled with complex charts and stern warnings. Lunar phases were particularly important. Many believed that sex during a full moon increased your odds of conception, but also your odds of giving birth to a lunatic. A waxing moon was good luck, a waning one brought weakness. And during an eclipse, don't even think about it. Not only could the child be marked physically, but their soul could be endangered. This was not date night. This was cosmic roulette. Historians still argue whether most medieval peasants truly believed in these astrological sex rules, or if they simply mimicked what educated clerics and physicians told them. But one thing's clear. The influence of the stars reached all the way into the bedroom, and people adjusted their desires accordingly. Not to be outdone, doctors of the day added their own flair to the madness. Medical authorities, like Galen and Avicenna, whose ideas were copied and recopied for centuries, taught that the stars didn't just influence personality, but also physical traits. Want a tall, clever child? Try to conceive when Jupiter is ascendant. Want to avoid a baby with melancholic humors? Translation, likely to write bad poetry and sigh a lot. Don't even look at Saturn. Some texts even claimed you could choose the gender of your child. Simply time the act for the right planetary alignment. Or my personal favorite, make sure the man sleeps on his right side and the woman on her left. Because obviously, gravity and the stars coordinate like a celestial dating app. It didn't stop there. Color-coded diets were sometimes recommended before sex to balance the humors. Men might be told to eat hot dry foods like roasted onions. Women cooler, moisture items like cucumbers and lettuce. The idea was to prep the body like a careful chef adjusting spices, except instead of soup, the result was hopefully a morally upright child with good teeth. And if that child did turn out oddly shaped or mentally unwell, naturally, you had only yourself and your poor lunar timing to blame. One 14th century manuscript recounts the story of a woman who gave birth to a baby covered in thick hair. The town whispered it was because she had conceived during a dark moon while staring at a goat. Another tale tells of twins born with mismatched features, supposedly the result of their mother glancing at a two-headed painting during conception. So remember, folks, watch what's hanging on your wall. Of course, not everyone had access to moon charts or astrological advice. The average peasant didn't own a telescope, much less a treatise on planetary influence, but superstitions filtered down. Midwives might whisper warnings about bad nights for coupling. Old women would shake their heads if a child was conceived during a thunderstorm. Even animals were said to behave differently depending on the stars, and if your goat refused to eat clover that day, maybe you should cancel your evening plans. As with many things in the Middle Ages, knowledge was a mix of genuine observation, garbled ancient texts, and a healthy dose of fear. Astrology offered a way to control the uncontrollable. It made sense of birth defects. It explained infertility. It gave couples something to blame besides each other. And honestly, when your only contraceptive was a hope and a prayer, you might as well consult the heavens too. But not all was doom and gloom. Some believed that good alignment could bring not only healthy children, but passionate, pleasurable sex. Venus and Jupiter, those frisky planets, were associated with desire and fertility. So, if the stars aligned, and the cows weren't sick, and your neighbor wasn't loudly praying again, you might find yourself blessed with both a fulfilling night and a child who wouldn't grow up to eat candles or curse in Latin. Still, you had to be cautious. A passing comet might ruin the whole thing. Or a dog howling at the wrong hour. Or maybe Mercury was cranky that week. Who really knew? The important thing was that your entire reproductive destiny was in your eyes tethered to the sky. So tonight, as your eyelids grow heavy and the stars twinkle faintly overhead, Just be grateful you don't have to plan your romantic life around Jupiter's mood swings, or worry that sneezing during conception might doom your child to become a juggler. Sleep well, and may your dreams be astrologically approved. You wake up and something feels off. Your legs are shaky, your stomach churns, and your neighbor just casually mentions that your womb might be on the move. Like literally. In the Middle Ages, people truly believed that the uterus had a mind of its own. Welcome to the wild world of wandering wombs and the many misguided efforts to keep them in their place. Imagine this: you're a medieval woman, and one day you faint unexpectedly. Or maybe you have a panic attack, or just feel really moody. The explanation: clearly your uterus has become bored and decided to take a little stroll around your body. This condition, known as hysterica passio, was taken extremely seriously. Physicians genuinely believed that the uterus could become unmoored and float upward, squishing your heart lungs or even your brain. Naturally, this caused all sorts of bizarre symptoms: convulsions, shortness of breath, sudden crying spells. Sound familiar? That's right. It was the medieval explanation for what we now understand as anxiety, depression, and other mental health conditions. Historians still argue whether these wandering womb theories were applied to all women, or just the ones that didn't quite fit the era's very tight mold of silent, obedient, and eternally fertile. Either way, it made for some truly unhinged treatments. Step 1. In treating a mobile uterus: smells. Lots and lots of smells. The idea was that you could coax the womb back into place using good or bad scents depending on its current location. If it was rising toward the head, you might place something pungent like burnt hair, or a bit of dung near the nose to scare it downward. At the same time, something sweet-smelling like rose oil or warm honey would be applied near the pelvis, like a fragrant invitation to come home. Reverse the sense if the uterus had somehow fallen too low, which, yes, they also believed could happen. And if scent-based uterine herding didn't work, well, there were always manual methods. Physicians and midwives, often far more knowledgeable, might attempt gentle pressure techniques. And by gentle, we of course mean arbitrary poking until something happens. Because when your anatomy textbooks are just loose translations of ancient Greek scrolls, you're not exactly working with precision. Oh, and let's not forget the medieval belief that prolonged celibacy could encourage wandering. Yes, sexlessness was sometimes seen as hazardous to female health. A bored womb lacking its regular exercise might go rogue. This belief stood in direct contradiction to all those purity and virtue sermons we just talked about. You as a woman were expected to be modest, chaste, and constantly available for childbirth, but also not too chaste, or your uterus might stage a protest march up your spine. It's exhausting, honestly. No wonder people were fainting. Men didn't exactly escape bizarre anatomical beliefs either. Some thinkers believed that excessive desire could cause men's bodies to fill with dangerous heat or vapors. The solution: bloodletting. Because if there's one thing medieval medicine loved more than leeches, it was draining you until you forgot what your problem was. But more on that later. Back to the uterus, because it gets even weirder. Some texts suggested that it was shaped like a small animal. One influential 12th century writer compared it to a hungry little creature that roamed the body in search of satisfaction. Hungry, little, creature. It's not hard to see how the language of fear and mystery got wrapped around women's bodies. You weren't just a person with symptoms. You were hosting a semi-sentient organ with the power to cause seizures and ruin marriages. And let's not forget hysteria itself. The term comes from the Greek word hystera, meaning uterus. The diagnosis of female hysteria lasted well into the modern era and was used to label everything from sexual desire to stubbornness to just being upset. Essentially, if you weren't smiling politely while churning butter and silently bearing 12 children, someone was going to blame your reproductive organs. By the late Middle Ages, some thinkers began to challenge the idea of the wandering womb. They noticed that men had similar symptoms: panic attacks, fainting, despair. The logical response should have been, maybe this isn't about uteruses. But instead, they invented male hysteria and moved on. Because heaven forbid we revise the whole theory. In practice, the wandering womb belief shaped not just medicine, but social behavior. If a woman acted out, cried in public, or just wanted a nap and some alone time, she might be sent to a religious retreat, examined by a physician, or even exorcised. Yep. Some cases of possessed women were later interpreted by modern scholars as simple cases of untreated trauma or mental illness. But at the time, it was all blamed on that little traveling troublemaker inside her, and the treatments, they got creative. Hot compresses, herbal tinctures, scented steam baths, vigorous prayer, and in some cases, forced marriage. That's right. If your womb was causing problems, the solution might be a husband. Because nothing soothes mysterious inner chaos like being handed over to a man named Bartholomew, who bathes twice a year and owns 3 chickens. All this left medieval women in a confusing place. Your body was a battleground between moral expectations, pseudoscience, and actual survival. If you were too passionate, something was wrong. If you were too indifferent, something was also wrong. If you got sick, your womb was misbehaving. If you didn't get pregnant, maybe your uterus had gone on strike. And so you went about your day with your little scented sachet tucked into your belt, hoping that the lavender would keep everything in place, and that no one would accuse you of witchcraft just for sighing too loudly during Mass. So tonight, as your covers settle and the night air cools, rest easy, knowing that your organs are exactly where they should be, and no one's coming at you with goat breath and a stick of incense to prove otherwise. You stand in the cold nave of a stone chapel, eyes cast downward, as a monk lectures on the virtues of celibacy, not just as a personal choice, but as a superpower. In the Middle Ages, abstaining from sex wasn't just about piety. It was believed to unlock mystical abilities, divine insight, and in extreme cases, literal levitation. You, my friend, are surrounded by people who think virginity is the fast track to sainthood and maybe even to flight. It might sound like medieval fan fiction, but this was a widespread belief. Celibacy was considered not only a religious ideal, but a biological upgrade. Resisting carnal urges wasn't just a way to impress your local bishop. It was believed to purify the body, clarify the mind, and draw you closer to the divine. The less attached you were to earthly pleasures, the lighter your soul became. Light enough, some claim, to hover. Historians still argue whether stories of floating monks were meant to be taken literally, or as poetic metaphors for spiritual highs. But medieval biographies of saints are full of floaty tales. One famous example, Saint Joseph of Cupertino, who was said to levitate during moments of intense prayer. Witnesses claimed he'd rise a few feet off the ground, sometimes mid-sermon, often after weeks of fasting, and you guessed it's strict celibacy. It wasn't just floating either. Celibate saints were believed to gain all sorts of miraculous perks: the ability to heal the sick, speak multiple languages, spontaneously commune with angels, and survive on nothing but Eucharist bread and pure vibes. Saint Catherine of Siena was said to have gone without food for years, sustained only by the body of Christ and a burning loathing of sin. You meanwhile just skip dinner and already feel faint. This obsession with celibacy had deep theological roots. The Church taught that original sin entered the world through lust, specifically through Adam and Eve's fateful fruit-snacking romp in Eden. Therefore, the less lust in your life, the closer you were to the purity of pre-fall humanity. Virgin martyrs like St. Agnes and St. Lucy became spiritual celebrities. Their stories often featured dramatic last stands where they defied marriage or rape, sometimes choosing death rather than defilement. These tales weren't just inspirational, they were weaponized as moral blueprints. For men, celibacy was framed as a noble struggle. Monks, priests, and hermits were spiritual warriors battling temptation through solitude, fasting, and occasionally self-flagellation. Imagine being so holy that your idea of a fun Friday night is whipping yourself with a branch to distract from impure thoughts. Monastic manuals often gave explicit instructions on how to avoid arousal, including cold baths, sleeping on hard floors, and memorizing entire psalms to recite at the first hint of impure imaginings. One 12th century monk advised readers to strike one's chest and run to the cloister if they felt tempted. Another recommended avoiding spicy food, laughing too much, or looking at one's own ankles for too long. Because clearly, ankles are a gateway sin. For women, celibacy was often tied up in control. Virgins were seen as untainted, closer to the Virgin Mary, and therefore more trustworthy in the eyes of male clergy. In reality, many women entered convents not solely out of religious devotion, but because it offered the only respectable alternative to marriage or poverty. Nuns could become scribes, teachers, even abbesses, positions of real power in a world where women had few options. And then there were the mystics. Women like Hildegard of Bingen and Julian of Norwich wrote vivid theological visions that they insisted came directly from God, visions often received after long periods of chastity and seclusion. The message was clear: want divine access, keep your pants on. Or, in most cases, keep your long linen shift secured with a rope belt and 37 buttons. Still, not everyone was on board with celibacy as a lifestyle. Even within the Church, there were murmurs of dissent. Some theologians worried that glorifying celibacy too much might undermine the value of marriage, which was inconveniently a sacrament. Others pointed out the obvious celibate clergy were often very much not celibate. In fact, many monastic records include warnings about secret relationships, surprise babies, and monks who mysteriously developed sick tummies every time Sister Agnes was around. But the myth persisted. Celibacy wasn't just a virtue, it was a brand. To be chaste was to be in control, to be pure, to be powerful, and in some cases, to be uncomfortably itchy from your horsehair undershirt, because nothing says holy like constant physical discomfort. The truly devout went to extremes. Some hermits moved to caves or perched on top of columns to avoid all human contact. Others refused to speak or wore chains around their waists to bind the flesh. One German nun even sealed herself inside a small walled cell voluntarily. That's a whole new level of avoiding Tinder. And yet, for all the drama, many people just quietly tried their best. They weren't saints or sinners, just regular folks navigating the spiritual maze of medieval morality. Maybe they kept a vow for a season. Maybe they slipped up and confessed. Maybe they stared at a monk too long and suddenly felt warm and confused. Because here's the thing, no one said out loud denying desire doesn't make it disappear. It just makes it weird. And in medieval Europe, it made it divinely weird. So tonight, as you lay in bed, thankful that no one expects you to fast for 40 days or wear a belt made of thorns, take a breath, and remember you don't need levitation to be at peace. Just a soft pillow, a clear conscience, and the knowledge that you don't have to memorize all 150 psalms just to fall asleep without sin. You wake before dawn, chilled by the stone floor beneath your feet and the echoes of whispered prayers outside. Today is market day, and you're not there for vegetables. You're here to buy a miracle. Not the spiritual kind, well, sort of. You've heard rumors of a relic that might just fix the most unspoken issue in your marriage bed performance. Welcome to the shadowy business of holy relics and their unexpected role in the medieval bedroom. The church controlled nearly every aspect of life in the Middle Ages, including rather awkwardly your sex life. Which is why people often turn to saints not for spiritual enlightenment, but for a little help under the blanket. Think of it like spiritual customer service for bodily concerns. And yes, there were specific saints you could pray to if things weren't, shall we say, rising to the occasion. One of the most famous of these was Saint Valentine, not just the patron of romantic love, but believe it or not invoked in cases of epilepsy fainting, and failing to consummate a marriage. Not quite what the modern greeting cards advertise. Pilgrims would travel long distances to touch or glimpse relics associated with Valentine, and others, hoping that proximity to the sacred could fix what no herbal potion or midnight goat charm could. Historians still argue whether people genuinely believed these relics had supernatural powers, or whether it was the medieval version of trying everything, because your in-laws were starting to ask uncomfortable questions. Either way, the line between the sacred and the sensual got very blurry. Take St. Agnes, for example. Virginal pure, and allegedly so spiritually potent that praying at her shrine could cure barrenness. Couples desperate for a child would make pilgrimage to her tomb, leaving offerings like embroidered cloths, fruit, or sometimes, oddly enough, wooden carvings shaped like babies. These weren't toys, they were proposals. Please, St. Agnes, send us a real one. Even stranger were the contact relics items that had supposedly touched the body of a saint. Bones were popular, hair too. And for the really devout, there were belt sandals, and in one documented case, a saint's toenail. Not the whole toe, just the nail. Because apparently even partial holiness was better than nothing when it came to bedroom blessings. But it wasn't all hopeful couples and saintly matchmaking. Some relics were more targeted. Reports tell of people touching a blessed staff or a sacred cross to specific parts of the body, usually in private, often in great embarrassment, hoping the divine spark might pass through like a heavenly lightning bolt. Think of it as medieval acupuncture, but with spiritual side effects. One particularly odd tale comes from 14th century France, where a man paralyzed by what we might now call anxiety-induced impotence was encouraged to sleep beside the tomb of a local saint. Not just near it, beside it. He did, and according to legend, awoke refreshed in body and renewed in spirit. The unspoken subtext being he was back in business. And it wasn't just men. Women, too, sought help from relics and saints, especially those associated with fertility. Saint Margaret of Antioch was a big name here. She had survived being swallowed by a dragon, which medieval minds interpreted as a metaphor for surviving childbirth. Naturally pregnant women clutched her medallions and whispered her name during labor, like a medieval epidural. Some midwives even carried small relics in their pouches, ready to press them into the hands or bellies of their clients. Was it magic? Was it medicine? Was it just something to hold on to when everything else felt terrifying? Probably all three. Now let's talk logistics. How did people even get these relics? Many were housed in monasteries or cathedrals, displayed in ornate boxes or behind heavy glass. But others traveled. Itinerant monks and relic sellers would tour towns like miracle salesmen, offering brief glimpses, or even a touch for a donation, of course. The more exotic the relic, the higher the fee. Want to touch the finger of St. John the Baptist? That'll cost you. Want to borrow a piece of St. Bernard's robe? Better have connections. There were even forgeries. Tons of them. Enough to fill every cathedral 10 times over. Some relics were so obviously fake like skulls that belonged to saints who died at age 12, but somehow had adult-sized heads that it's almost impressive. Still, belief was powerful. And when you're out of options, even a questionable toenail starts to look like hope. Not everyone approved. Some theologians warned that relying too much on relics for physical blessings bordered on superstition. Others pointed out that saints were supposed to care about your soul, not your libido. But most people ignored those voices. Because when your nights were long, your clothes were itchy, and your partner was starting to give you that disappointed look again, divine intervention felt like your best bet. Of course, success was never guaranteed. For every miraculous healing, there were dozens of awkward silences and sheepish confessions. But still, people kept coming. They believed. And sometimes, that belief alone was enough to make a difference. The placebo effect, as we call it now, has always been part of the human story. So tonight, as the fire dims and your blankets settle, imagine a world where your most private hopes rode on the back of a pilgrim's pouch wrapped in velvet and faith. Where saints and relics weren't just symbols, but lifelines. And where, no matter how strange or unscientific it all sounds, someone probably once whispered, "It's working," and meant it. Sleep tight. And if you dream of ancient saints tonight, well, maybe they're still listening. The tavern smells like burnt onions and old shoes, and someone's just handed you a clay vial filled with what they claim is powdered unicorn horn. You're told to sprinkle a bit under your tongue before bedtime, and presto, you'll be full of vigor by sunrise. Welcome to the medieval world of aphrodisiacs and potions, where love, desire, and desperation met in some truly strange places, including the bottom of a goblet. Let's start with the classics. Everyone wanted to boost their romantic performance or stir up someone else's affection, and the options available ranged from culinary curiosities to full-on witchy weirdness. Dried beaver testicles ground into a fine powder. Apparently, a sure way to ignite passion. Crocodile hearts soaked in wine, even better. And don't get me started on crushed emeralds. Pricey, dangerous, but oh so promising if you had a noble budget and nothing to lose. Historians still argue whether these ingredients were ever truly believed to work, or if the act of preparing and consuming them was part of a ritualized placebo effect. But one thing is certain. People went all in on these strange concoctions, often mixing love-fear and a shocking amount of animal parts into their daily routines. Let's say you're a nervous young groom with a looming wedding night. You'd visit the local apothecary who'd offer you a blend of ginger cinnamon and dried mandrake, maybe with a dash of honey wine for courage. Sound tame. That's the polite version. In other corners of Europe, you might get goat bile, powdered antler, or brace yourself a tonic made with bat blood. The thinking bats are nocturnal and virile, so clearly drinking their essence would help you perform after dark. And if you were trying to prevent desire, the recipe book flipped entirely. Monks and nuns sometimes consumed bitter herbs like rue or lettuce believed to cool the body. Cold and dry in medieval humor theory meant less lust. In some extreme cases, they even wore charms made from lead or iron to suppress temptation, basically emotional chastity belts, but shinier. But aphrodisiacs weren't just for nervous lovers or cloistered monks. Married couples also turned to these potions, especially if things had gone a little stale. A wife might slip her husband a bit of spiced mead with secret ingredients borrowed from a midwife. A husband might smear a curious paste on his wrists before bed. The ingredients were almost always vague, but the confidence was oddly specific. Take this, and she'll look at you like it's spring. One of the strangest love-inducing recipes came from a 14th century Italian herbal manual. It involved steeping roasted worms in red wine for 3 days, then straining and sipping just before trying to woo someone. Did it work? Hard to say. But if your breath smelled like worm wine and someone still kissed you, they were either very smitten or also drinking it. Let's not ignore the symbolic foods either. Certain items were believed to naturally arouse the senses. Almonds, honey figs, and even eels were associated with sensuality. Spices like saffron and cloves were luxury items and often linked with indulgence, so adding them to food wasn't just about taste, it was about hinting. Subtle maybe, effective debatable. But remember, if all you ate was gritty bread and cabbage, even a mildly sweet fig could feel like a kiss on the soul. Then there were love powders, dry mixes you could carry around in a pouch and sneak into someone's drink. These were borderline magical, often combining ground herbs with hair clippings, nail trimmings, and sometimes bodily fluids. The ethics of love powders were sketchy at best, but people believed in their power. And if you got caught using one, depending on your location, you might end up fined, excommunicated, or accused of witchcraft. Speaking of magic, not all love potions came from apothecaries. Folk healers, often women, crafted tonics that walked the line between medicine and superstition. In villages, they were sometimes trusted more than doctors. But in cities, or during periods of witch panic, they were the first to be blamed when a marriage soured or when a man found himself mysteriously weakened. Even religious figures occasionally dipped their toes into the aphrodisiac trade. Some monasteries sold holy wines, blessed by saints that were said to encourage fertility or rekindle desire in older couples. No one admitted what was in them, but rumors included everything from deer antler dust to fennel steeped in vinegar. Just enough ambiguity to be holy and horny. And yes, let's talk about unicorns again. Their horns, actually narwhal tusks, passed off as magical relics were ground into shimmering white powder and sold as protection against poison infertility and marital malaise. You couldn't afford it, of course, but rich nobles bought them by the gram, swearing it brought back the spark. Honestly, it might have been the price tag doing most of the heavy lifting. Despite the wild ingredients and questionable methods, some of these ancient recipes had a kernel of truth. Ginger, for instance, really does increase blood flow. Wine certainly lowers inhibitions. Honey is an energy booster. So while bat wings and beaver bits might not hold up under scientific scrutiny, there were probably some very real effects, physical, emotional, and psychological. And let's not forget the social aspect. Sharing a mysterious tonic, whispering about its powers, and laughing over its bitterness might have been more effective at building intimacy than the drink itself. Sometimes belief and attention is the best aphrodisiac. So tonight, as you nestle under your blankets, be glad you didn't have to roast worms for affection or barter for powdered antler at a flea market. Let your dreams be sweet, your ingredients be edible, and may no one ever offer you a cup of beetle wine in the name of love. You're half asleep, tucked into a straw mattress, when something presses on your chest. You try to move but can't. You open your mouth to scream, but no sound comes out. A heavy shadow looms above whispering things you don't understand. Is it a dream? Or if you were living in the Middle Ages, would you believe it was something far worse, a visit from a demon lover? Meet the incubus and succubus, the original nightmare fuel for medieval bedroom panic. The incubus, a male demon, supposedly crept into the beds of women to impregnate them against their will. The succubus, his seductive female counterpart, targeted men drawing out their essence while they slept. It wasn't just mythology. It was considered a legitimate explanation for sleep paralysis, erotic dreams, and even mysterious pregnancies. And yes, that meant if you woke up in a compromised state, people weren't whispering awkward dream. They were whispering demonic assault. In medieval Europe, sex and the supernatural were tangled in a knot of fear, guilt, and superstition. People didn't understand biology the way we do now. They didn't know what caused dreams, night emissions, or hallucinations. So when something unexplainable happened, especially something shameful or taboo, it was often blamed on outside forces, preferably ones with horns and a bad attitude. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were used mostly by clergy to scare people into abstinence, or if they reflected genuine terror among the populace. But records from the era are filled with confessions, sermons, and even trial testimonies describing these demonic encounters in graphic, terrified detail. One notorious 15th century text, the Malleus Maleficarum, even laid out how succubi collected sperm from their victims, passed it to incubi, and used it to create demon-human hybrids. That's right. People were taught that demons had a long-distance supply chain, like some nightmarish UPS for bodily fluids. And these weren't fringe ideas. Even respected theologians debated how demons managed reproduction, considering they didn't technically have bodies. Some argued that incubi took on human form using dead corpses. Others claimed demons could borrow flesh, temporarily occupying a person to carry out their agenda. And if this sounds suspiciously close to an ex blaming their bad behavior on being possessed, well, some things never change. You roll over in your medieval bed, trying not to think about it. But there's more. Some people believed these demons weren't just random visitors. They had favorites. Men reported being visited by the same succubus night after night, often describing her in vivid detail. Long black hair, glowing eyes, a voice like thunder. Women, too, claimed that their incubi became jealous or vengeful if they tried to resist. And if a child was born out of wedlock or under suspicious circumstances, enter the demon father theory. People claimed some babies looked too strong, too hairy, or had uncanny abilities. In one case, a woman insisted her baby was born speaking Latin. The church didn't believe her, but they did make her do public penance just in case. There were also the famous dream temptations of saints. Saint Anthony, for instance, was said to have been plagued by seductive visions while living in the desert. Artists often depicted him surrounded by half-naked demons trying to tempt him into sin. The implication: even the holiest of men weren't safe from midnight visitors. So what could you do to protect yourself? Aside from staying celibate and sleeping with one eye open, people turned to all sorts of remedies. Charms were popular small amulets made of iron bone or blessed wood, worn around the neck or placed under pillows. Some slept with crucifixes clutched in their hands. Others burned herbs like fennel sage or demonbane, a dramatic name for a perfectly ordinary plant, to purify the bedroom. More extreme measures included sleeping in church fasting or undergoing exorcism, not because you were possessed, but because your dreams were. One 14th century manuscript even recommends whispering specific Bible verses before sleep, aimed not at protection, but at making yourself unappealing to demons. Imagine tucking yourself in and muttering, "Let not thy servant tempt the night," with fruitless longing, the medieval equivalent of saying, "Not tonight, Satan." The line between nightmare and reality was blurry. Sleep paralysis, night terrors, and even epilepsy were often seen as spiritual afflictions. And because sexuality was so deeply tied to shame and sin, dreams that included any form of desire were interpreted as moral failings or worse, invitations to evil. Still, for all the fear, there was fascination. The idea of beautiful, seductive spirits weaving through the night had an eerie allure. Stories of succubi and incubi traveled far and wide, fueling songs, plays, and whispered gossip. And as terrifying as they were, they also gave people a strange kind of comfort. If a mistake could be blamed on a demon, maybe it wasn't your fault after all. Tonight, as your eyes close and your limbs grow heavy, think of all those people centuries ago lying, just as you are now wondering if that shadow in the corner was just a trick of the moonlight or something else. If you feel a breeze, it's probably just the wind. Probably. You're at the blacksmith shop, not for horseshoes or a new cooking pot, but for something far more personal. The blacksmith gestures toward a small wooden chest, opens it with a key that jingles ominously. And there it is, a metal belt with locking mechanisms, narrow slits, and the kind of design that screams both discomfort and bad decisions. Congratulations. You've just been introduced to the Chastity belt. Ah, yes, the Chastity belt, one of the most enduring and misunderstood artifacts of medieval mythology. You've seen the cartoons, maybe heard the jokes, but in reality, it wasn't just a goofy concept or historical meme. The idea of locking up a body to protect virtue, or more often property, was rooted in deep anxieties about fidelity, inheritance, and control. Let's rewind. The notion of chastity belts as a widespread medieval phenomenon is actually debated. Historians still argue whether they were commonly used in the Middle Ages or were more of a Renaissance invention, retroactively blamed on earlier centuries. Some believe most surviving examples are from the 16th century or even later, products of Victorian imagination rather than genuine medieval modesty. But make no mistake, the idea of the chastity belt very much existed during the medieval period. And whether real, symbolic, or ceremonial, it reflected a troubling truth. Women's sexuality was seen not as their own, but as something to be guarded, managed, and if necessary, locked away. Suppose you're a nobleman about to leave for the Crusades. You don't trust your young bride, or perhaps more accurately, you don't trust the dozens of handsome squires who'll still be around while you're off fighting infidels. The solution: commission, a custom metal device, one that will keep her secure. Bonus points if the key stays around your neck like a romantic but deeply problematic necklace. These belts were often made of iron with narrow slits for minimal hygiene and maximum discomfort. Some were padded with leather, others had spikes. Spikes, as if abstaining weren't already unpleasant enough. Imagine walking, let alone sitting, with a literal cage between your thighs. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't breathable, and it certainly wasn't foolproof. But here's the twist. It's likely most women who wore these didn't actually wear them 24/7. Many historians now believe chastity belts were more symbolic than functional ritual objects, or wedding gifts designed to imply fidelity, not enforce it. Some might have been used short-term, like during periods of separation illness or religious fasting. Others may never have been worn at all, just kept as ominous conversation pieces. Still, enough references appear in medieval art and literature to suggest the concept was known and feared. Moral tales told of wives left alone and tempted by lust only to be saved or punished by the sudden click of a lock. In some versions, the belt miraculously tightens if a woman strays. In others, an angel descends to bless the chastity key. Either way, the message is clear. Virtue must be controlled, preferably by someone else. Men, you ask, were there male chastity belts? Technically, yes, but they were rare and usually framed as punishment devices, not protective ones. The imbalance speaks volumes. In medieval thought, women were the gatekeepers of morality, but also its weakest link. They were expected to be pure and passive, but paradoxically, also held responsible for seducing others. So naturally, the solution was external hardware. Even more unsettling chastity belts weren't only about adult relationships. Some versions were reportedly used to protect young girls from assault, especially in times of war or civil unrest. And though records are sparse, the very fact that these belts existed in child sizes hints at a much darker side to the story. One of the more bizarre developments came later during the Renaissance and Enlightenment. Medical thinkers began recommending chastity belts as a cure for masturbation. That's right, metal pants, as an anti-itch strategy. Parents might strap these onto teenagers and keep the key. Some belts were even designed with tiny bells to alert anyone if the wearer tried to tamper with them. Nothing quite like turning puberty into a security system. The production of these devices was a niche industry, often handled by locksmiths and metalworkers who specialized in precision. Imagine having to explain your latest commission. No, not a gate latch. Something a bit more delicate. Some belts were engraved with moral sayings, biblical quotes, or even the names of saints. Others were alarmingly plain, as if trying to avoid attracting attention to an already unmentionable topic. By the 19th century, chastity belts had taken on a life of their own in the popular imagination. They appeared in museums, books, and curiosity shops. Some were hoaxes fabricated to shock or amuse. Others were genuine relics, rusted but intact, bearing silent witness to a long history of fear and fascination. The Victorians, never ones to pass up a good repression metaphor, displayed them with a mix of horror and glee. And while today most people view chastity belts as medieval myths or fetish objects, the concept still lingers. Modern versions exist, though thankfully made of softer materials and used with consent. But the underlying idea that sexuality must be policed, restrained, or outsourced hasn't vanished entirely. So tonight, as you lie in comfort, no iron hinges or padlocks in sight, take a moment to be grateful that your autonomy is your own, that you don't need a key to be trusted, and that if someone ever tries to hand you a spiked underwear set as a wedding gift. You can say no, politely, firmly, and preferably while backing out of the room. You're standing at the edge of a bustling medieval bathhouse, steam billowing out through cracks in the timbered walls, the faint scent of rosemary sweat and ambition floating in the air. Inside, things are lively. In the Middle Ages, bathhouses weren't just places to get clean. They were hubs of gossip, relaxation, negotiation, and depending on the hour and location, something a little more risque. Welcome to the world of medieval public baths, where cleanliness met curiosity and modesty often took a holiday. Now, before you get too comfortable, you should know that the medieval approach to hygiene was, let's say, complicated. Contrary to the myth that people never bathed, many Europeans, especially in urban centers, actually loved their baths. Bathhouses, known in Latin as balnea, dotted the cities of France, Germany, and Italy. Some towns had dozens. They were heated by wood-fired furnaces with hot and cold pools, private rooms, and attendants who'd scrub your back trim, your nails, and in some cases, offer more specialized services. Historians still argue whether bathhouses were primarily about hygiene, health, or hedonism. But by the 14th century, the answer seemed to be all of the above. So here you are stripped to a linen shift. Or if you're bold or rich, nothing at all. The men's and women's sections might be separated, or not. In some places, especially in Germany, co-ed bathing was completely normal. Entire families would go together. Merchants would strike deals neck-deep in hot water. Couples flirted, and sometimes behind the curtain, things escalated. That's where things got sticky figuratively. Church authorities weren't thrilled about bathhouses. They issued warning sermons and in some cases full-on bans. The concern wasn't bathing itself. Cleanliness was next to godliness. After all, it was the atmosphere, the nudity, the mingling, the fact that a public health institution was doubling as a dating service with questionable boundaries. And yet, bathhouses thrived. Some were lavish with mosaic floors, painted ceilings, and attendants offering scented oils, music, and refreshments. You could get wine-spiced cakes, and if the rumors were true, companionship not listed on the menu. To curb the extracurriculars, city councils tried all sorts of tactics: curfews, fines, surprise inspections. In London, for instance, bathhouses were sometimes shut down during Lent. In Paris, they were required to have windows open at all times so authorities could observe behavior. Nothing like a spiritual side-eye with your foot soak. Even so, many bathhouses leaned into their reputations. Some took on cheeky nicknames like the Stew, the Lily House, or more bluntly, the Hot Place. And those that doubled as brothels weren't exactly subtle. Workers might wear elaborate jewelry, paint their nails a rare luxury, or learn songs and dances to entertain guests while they toweled off. Of course, not all baths were pleasure dens. Many were genuinely health-focused. Medieval physicians believed that bathing opened the pores, balanced the humors, and expelled toxins. There were entire medical manuals on bath timing, temperature, and technique. Sick patients might be prescribed a weekly soak with thyme and chamomile. Wealthy invalids were sometimes transported to mineral springs to take the waters in elaborate rituals that blended medicine with theater. For the lower classes, bathhouses offered a rare moment of comfort. A place to wash away the grime of the fields, soothe sore muscles, and escape the cramped, smoky homes of daily life. It was a social equalizer up to a point. Nobles had private baths. Monks had cloistered washrooms. But in most towns, bathhouses were public, accessible, and wildly popular until the plagues hit. Yes, enter the Black Death stage left. In the mid-14th century, as bubonic plague tore through Europe, suspicion of bathing grew. Some doctors argued that hot baths opened the body to bad air and made you more vulnerable. Others warned that shared water could spread disease. And just like that, bathhouses started to close. Cities that once boasted dozens of stews had none. Public opinion turned. Cleanliness was no longer next to godliness, it was dangerous. And so bathing fell out of fashion. Not overnight, but gradually and with much reluctance. People began to rely more on dry cleaning methods, rubbing with cloths, changing linen shirts frequently, which absorbed sweat and odor, and dousing themselves in perfumes. Powdered wigs came later, but the groundwork for covering up, instead of washing off, was laid here. The bathhouses never fully recovered. By the 16th century, many had been repurposed, demolished, or sanitized into oblivion. Their steamy golden age faded into legend and satire, but echoes of them lingered. In literature, in whispered jokes, in the kind of old songs your grandfather wouldn't sing in polite company, and in the idea that a bath could be something more than just practical. It could be sensual, social, scandalous. So tonight, as you curl into your sheets, maybe a little cleaner than your medieval counterpart, remember those echoing stone halls, those warm wooden tubs, and the laughter rising with the steam. You might have gone in for a scrub, but you definitely left with a story. It's late evening, and the candles are flickering. You've been handed a small booklet, handwritten, slightly smudged, bound in worn leather, and told not to show anyone. It's not a spell book or a heretic's diary. It's something far more scandalous, a medieval sex manual. Yes, they existed. Contrary to what you might expect, people in the Middle Ages weren't entirely shy about discussing the mechanics of intimacy. They just buried it under layers of metaphor caution and deeply questionable anatomy drawings. These texts were rare, often cloaked in religious justification or medical language, but they were absolutely real. You sitting by candlelight with the flickering shadows of your chamber dancing on the walls might be one of the lucky or nosy few to read one. The most famous of these texts was the Secretum Secretorum, or the Secret of Secrets. Though not exclusively about sex, it included sections on reproduction, bodily fluids, and the correct timing for intimacy, allegedly written by Aristotle for Alexander the Great. Though that's wildly inaccurate, it was a medieval bestseller. Want to conceive a clever child? Avoid intercourse during thunderstorms. Want a boy instead of a girl? Eat leeks beforehand. Simple stuff, really. Historians still argue whether such manuals were widely read by the public or remained cloistered among scholars and physicians. But some passages definitely made their way into folk knowledge. In some regions, it was common advice to avoid intimacy during a full moon, not because of werewolves, but because too much light encourages pride in the child. That's right, your baby's personality could be ruined by celestial mood lighting. Other manuals, like the Trotula, focused on women's health and included very direct instructions: how to stimulate desire, how to revive a frigid partner, even how to fake pleasure to keep a marriage stable. Yes, medieval ladies had performance anxiety too. The Trotula was practical, earthy, and wildly ahead of its time, especially considering it may have been written by a woman, or at least compiled from female voices. Illustrations were rare but memorable. You might see an awkwardly drawn man and woman in a position that looks more like interpretive dance than romance. Anatomical sketches often showed the body in cross-section, complete with little arrows and earnest but deeply confused captions. One popular medieval diagram labeled the uterus as having 7 separate chambers, each one responsible for a different type of baby. If the embryo landed in chamber 4, congrats, you'd get a poet. Chamber 6, a warrior. Chamber 1, well, better luck next time. The manuals often danced a tightrope between helpful and horrifying. They warned of the dangers of passion, cautioning that excessive joy during intercourse might lead to a burning of the liver. They advised newlyweds to avoid eye contact during the act, lest their gazes ignite sinful pride. And they strongly discouraged intimacy on Sundays, or feast days, or Fridays, or before confession, or after confession. Really, if you followed every rule, you'd be left with maybe 3 viable Tuesdays a year. But despite all the warnings, some passages shimmered with genuine tenderness. One manuscript from 13th century Andalusia, for instance, encouraged couples to smell each other sweetly, to speak kindly, and to prepare the bed with herbs and pleasant oils. It's shockingly modern advice, essentially. Set the mood. Be nice. Don't be weird. Honestly, still holds up. And then there were the more risque works. The Romance of the Rose. A sprawling allegorical poem became infamous, not just for its floral metaphors, but for its graphic journey from innocent flirtation to, well, very not innocent conclusions. It framed seduction as a courtly game full of whispered compliments, strategic glances, and the occasional poem scribbled on a silk sleeve. Was it high art? Debatable. Was it widely copied and secretly passed around monasteries like forbidden candy? Absolutely. One surprisingly explicit guide from medieval India, the Kama Sutra, made its way westward via trade routes and scholarly translations. Though not always accessible to your average peasant, it contributed to the larger medieval understanding that sex was a subject worth studying, even if you had to cloak it in 17 layers of allegory to avoid ecclesiastical side-eye. Of course, not everyone approved. Church authorities condemned such texts, especially those with too much detail or too much accuracy. Possessing one could be seen as evidence of moral corruption. Reading one aloud in public, that was a fast track to public penance or worse. Yet the books persisted, hidden in apothecaries' drawers, copied into the margins of medical texts whispered about in bathhouses, because people were curious, people were confused, people were people. And in a world where sex was tightly regulated, quietly feared, and rarely explained, even a badly drawn diagram could feel like a revelation. For those who couldn't read, and that was most word of mouth, carried the knowledge. Midwives, herbalists, and traveling peddlers often served as the village sex educators. Their advice ranged from charmingly helpful, always warm the sheets before bed, to terrifyingly wrong, tie a ribbon around your ankle to avoid pregnancy. But every bit of knowledge helped fill the void that books left behind. So tonight, as you close your eyes and the imagined scent of lavender and old parchment fades, know this: behind every grand cathedral and scholarly scroll, there were people asking the same old questions. Am I doing this right? Is this normal? Will they still like me in the morning? And sometimes the answer came in the form of a quietly borrowed manual, a whispered tip, or an awkward diagram of a uterus with 7 mystery chambers. You find yourself standing in a quiet chapel walls, flickering with candlelight as a priest finishes his sermon. He's not talking about salvation or sin, at least not directly. he's talking about your marriage bed, specifically how and when you're allowed to use it. Because in the Middle Ages, the church didn't just concern itself with your Sunday mornings, it had a very specific schedule for your nighttime activities too. Welcome to the ecclesiastical calendar of intimacy. It's stricter than your school timetable, more complicated than Lent, and about as romantic as a cold bucket of water. You see, medieval church doctrine was deeply invested in your bedroom behavior. Sex wasn't just a private act, it was a spiritual event, one with rules, exceptions, loopholes, and lots of Latin. Clergy taught that the only acceptable purpose for intercourse was procreation within marriage. Pleasure was at best a regrettable side effect, at worst a sin. Historians still argue whether these teachings were universally enforced or largely aspirational. Sermons and confession manuals make it clear that rules were taught and repeated. But what happened in actual households probably varied wildly depending on the couple, the region, and the thickness of the bedroom walls. Let's talk numbers. On paper, the church banned sex on over 100 days a year. That included every Sunday, the Lord's Day, obviously every Friday, in honor of the crucifixion, all feast days of saints, all major religious seasons, Lent, Advent, and others, the eve of communion, days of fasting, the entire menstrual cycle. Yes, really add that up, and you're looking at nearly 1/3 of the calendar marked as off-limits. And that's before accounting for special local feasts, extra penance days, or random superstitions that tacked on more restrictions just to be safe. If you broke the rules, technically you were committing a sin even as a married couple. This might require confession penance, or in extreme cases, public shame. And no simply feeling extra loving on the feast of St. Apollonia wasn't a valid excuse. So you tiptoed through your marriage like a liturgical ninja, dodging saints and feast days like moral landmines. Even your wedding night might be subject to delay if it coincided with a religious holiday. Nothing says romance like a priest advising you to wait until after Ascension Day. But of course, people are people, and medieval folks didn't always follow the rules. Confession manuals include all sorts of awkwardly detailed questions about what couples may have done, when, how, and with what attitude. The church was obsessed not only with when you did it, but how. Positions, intentions, even thoughts were scrutinized. The missionary position was preferred not because it was efficient, but because it was least sinful. Anything else risked being labeled unnatural, even if both partners agreed and enjoyed it. And heaven forbid you showed enthusiasm. According to some theologians, too much eagerness, even within marriage, was a sign of carnality. A husband was supposed to lead with moderation, and a wife was supposed to submit with humility. No winking, no giggling, no sighing. Basically, the church wanted your marital intimacy to resemble a solemn board meeting held under candlelight with your eyes closed. If this sounds suffocating, it's worth noting that some clergy pushed back. A few brave theologians argued that marital love could be pleasurable and still holy. One even wrote that affection between spouses was a foretaste of divine unity. But those voices were quieter, and often drowned out by fire and brimstone preachers wagging their fingers at almond-eyed altar boys and curious brides. Meanwhile, ordinary people found ways to navigate the maze. Some couples simply ignored the rules. Others consulted confessors known to be lenient. A few got creative with calendar interpretations. Well, technically, St. Cuthbert's feast ends at sunset, and we didn't start until after the bells. If you think modern people bend rules to avoid guilt, imagine trying to justify a Thursday night cuddle in a world where a bishop might be watching from the rafters. And of course, not all marriages were affectionate to begin with. Many were arranged transactional or cold. For some couples, these church-imposed breaks were a relief. Others, especially those trying desperately to conceive, found the restrictions cruel and confusing. Can you imagine finally finding time to be intimate only to realize it's St. Etheldreda's day of perpetual abstinence not helpful? So why so many rules? Partly, it was about control. The church wanted to shape every aspect of life from meals to marriages. And partly, it was about fear of desire, of chaos of bodies that couldn't be easily explained. The calendar became a map of moral boundaries drawn in ink incense and anxiety. But despite the stern sermons, people kept falling in love, making babies, breaking rules. They found loopholes, whispered excuses, prayed for forgiveness, or didn't. Because no matter how many red X's filled the calendar, desire has always made its own schedule. So tonight, as your limbs grow heavy and the silence deepens, imagine a world where intimacy was sacred, structured, and scheduled with near-obsessive precision. Where your bedroom life was dictated by bell saints and fasting charts. And where, if all else failed, you might light a candle, say a quiet prayer, and hope St. Apollonia wasn't listening too closely. You're walking through a bustling medieval market, past bakers, butchers, and candle sellers, when a man in a crimson hood shouts from behind a stall, "Worry not, good sir. Cure your cursed urges, or ignite desire where none was before." His cart is a chaotic shrine to questionable remedies, bottles of syrupy elixirs, pouches of odd-smelling powders, and something suspiciously labeled essence of dragonfire. You're about to step into the strange and sometimes stomach-churning world of medieval medicine and its approach to, well, intimacy. Let's get one thing straight: medieval doctors meant well. They worked from what they had mostly ancient Greek theories, filtered through a few centuries of guesswork and hopeful incantation. The dominant medical model was the humoral theory, which said that the human body was governed by four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Every condition, including bedroom dysfunction, was blamed on these humors being out of balance. Too much cold and wet. You were sluggish and passionless. Too much heat and dryness. Congratulations, you were a danger to yourself and others. It wasn't about what you wanted. It was about your bile behaving badly. Historians still argue whether humoral diagnoses were more symbolic than scientific, but there's no denying they guided treatments. If you lacked desire, a doctor might prescribe warming foods, ginger cinnamon, or red wine. If you had too much desire, yes, that was considered a problem. You might be sent to a monastery or told to chew lettuce and sleep on a cold stone floor. It was all very subtle. But the truly bizarre treatments came from apothecaries and folk healers who offered tonics with ingredients that would terrify any modern pharmacist. Dried wolf liver, fox testicles, roasted ants, and the ever-popular stone of the goat's stomach, which was apparently useful for everything. One 13th century Italian manual recommended applying ground emerald paste to the forehead to suppress lust, because nothing says abstinence like a sparkling green headache. And if the issue was infertility, well, brace yourself. Treatments got creative. For men, it might involve a daily tonic of boiled eggs mixed with crushed leeks and a whisper of badger fat. For women, Remedies often required wearing amulets, drinking herbal brews, or sitting on warm bricks after a complicated ritual involving basil and candle wax. One German text advised women to sleep with a carved wooden phallus under the bed, not for use, but for symbolic alignment of the womb. Medieval medicine loved a good metaphor. Then there were the Euromancers, yes people who diagnosed health conditions by examining urine. A trained Euromancer could supposedly tell if a woman was pregnant, if a man was overheated with desire, or if someone had been engaging in excessive delights. All from a flask of warm pee. And they charged accordingly. Want more? Enter the leeches. If you suffered from too much burning desire, a physician might recommend bloodletting. A leech on the thigh or behind the ear was believed to calm the passions. There were even cases of applying leeches near very sensitive regions. Desperate times, as they say. Of course, not all treatments were invasive. Some healers leaned heavily on aromatherapy. Scents like myrrh, rose, and musk were used to either ignite or suppress interest. You might be given a sachet to wear beneath your clothes, carefully blended by an apothecary, with the air of a perfume artist/matchmaker. A well-scented tunic could be the difference between a good evening and a week of awkward silence. And yes, some treatments were more psychological. Physicians might advise a man to avoid looking at attractive people, to occupy himself with long walks and non-erotic conversation. For women, advice often included prayer fasting and sleeping fully clothed, preferably in wool. There's a medieval letter from a French bishop recommending that an overly flirtatious nun be reassigned to laundry duty where the steam may cool her fire. An image both absurd and strangely poetic. One of the oddest treatments involved astrology. Medieval doctors would sometimes consult the stars before offering advice. If Venus was in the wrong house, your passions were doomed. If Mars was dominant, you were probably too aggressive in courtship. Some couples were even advised to delay intimacy until the moon entered a more fertile phase. Mercury retrograde. Maybe just stick to cuddling. But not all medicine was ridiculous. Some practices bordered on real science. Observations about diet stress and rest influencing libido were surprisingly accurate. And herbs like ginseng damiana and ashwagandha, still sold today as natural aphrodisiacs, were already in use. Sometimes the treatment worked. Sometimes it made things worse. And sometimes it was the attention itself, the ritual, the effort, that reminded people they were human, fragile, and worthy of care. Still, the line between healer and charlatan was thin. For every wise midwife or thoughtful herbalist, there was someone pushing powdered frog legs and promising miracles. And in a time when people feared sin disease and damnation in equal measure, the appeal of a quick fix was hard to resist. So tonight, as your head sinks into your pillow and your humors settle into a balanced, non-frothing state, remember the strange blend of wisdom and weirdness that shaped medieval medicine. Be glad your remedies come in tidy pills and not boiled badger intestines. And if anyone ever offers you emerald paste for your romantic issues, maybe just smile, nod, and back away slowly. You're sitting on a three-legged stool in a cold, damp room, nervously watching as a robed man opens a thick ledger. Across from you, your spouse avoids your gaze. Between you stands a priest, a scribe, and possibly a town official. No, this isn't the start of a courtroom drama. It's a church-sanctioned bedroom interrogation, and it's about to get awkward. Welcome to the ecclesiastical inquest into your marital intimacy. Because in the Middle Ages, if your marriage wasn't going well, especially if it hadn't been consummated. You didn't just talk to your friends or write passive-aggressive poetry. You might have had to go to court, church court, where people asked personal questions, very personal. This wasn't as rare as you might think. Marriages were not only spiritual contracts, but legal ones, and one of the requirements for a valid marriage was consummation. If a couple failed to do the deed or claimed they couldn't, well, that was serious business. Serious enough for investigations, testimony, and sometimes demonstrations. Historians still argue whether consummation cases were more about justice or spectacle, but the records we have show that such trials were surprisingly detailed, almost invasive, and occasionally okay, frequently ridiculous. Let's say you're a noble woman whose marriage has remained mysteriously cold. Maybe your husband is shy. Maybe he's uninterested. Maybe you've both been avoiding the issue by pretending that fasting days last all week. But now your family is pressuring you. They want heirs. They want alliances. They want results. So you file a complaint non-consummation. The court takes it seriously. Soon both parties are summoned. Witnesses are called maids, midwives, servants, anyone who might know something. The testimony often includes whether the marriage bed was disturbed, whether any sounds were heard, or if sheets were found stained. Sometimes priests performed a ritual blessing on the bed before encouraging the couple to give it another go with divine support. No pressure, right? And if there was suspicion of impotence, oh boy. The accused might be examined by a panel of experts, usually elderly matrons or physicians tasked with determining whether the husband was physically capable. In one bizarre case, a man was ordered to perform before witnesses to prove his virility. No, not in front of a crowd, thankfully, but in a separate room under very awkward supervision with results to be reported to the court. If this sounds horrifying, imagine being the poor scribe who had to write it all down in formal Latin. On the flip side, a wife could also be examined to see whether her body showed signs of ever having received a husband. These exams were deeply invasive, incredibly flawed, and frankly traumatic by modern standards. But in the eyes of the church, they were a necessary step toward validating or annulling a marriage. If one spouse confessed to refusing intimacy without cause, that too could lead to annulment. And the definitions of cause were strict. Illness, disfigurement, or extreme cruelty might qualify, but simply not feeling it, not a chance. Sometimes couples accused each other. One would say, "She turns away when I approach." The other might retort, "He snores through the night and eats too many onions." Courts had to sift through these claims, searching for some combination of spiritual violation and physical evidence. Cases could drag on for months, and the longer they went unresolved, the more reputations crumbled under public scrutiny. But here's the strange part. These cases weren't always about dysfunction. Sometimes they were used as exit strategies. Imagine being stuck in a loveless or arranged marriage. If you could convince the court that the union had never been consummated, you might be granted freedom. No scandalous adultery required, just a quiet, disappointed statement under oath. Some couples conspired to use this loophole. Others fought tooth and nail to prove the opposite. One medieval couple reportedly broke into their own church file to adjust the testimony. Desperate times, etc. The church wasn't totally heartless. In cases where intimacy was deemed impossible due to injury or trauma, a separation could be granted with dignity. In a few rare and progressive instances, couples were even allowed to remain married while living separately, an early version of emotional divorce. But more often, the focus was on the act itself. Had it happened? Could it happen? Would it happen under the right circumstances? The implications of these inquiries were vast. Children born into unconsummated marriages might be deemed illegitimate. Dowries could be lost. Lands and titles reverted. For nobles, it was political dynamite. For commoners, it could mean social ruin. For women, especially, the stigma of barrenness or coldness could stick for life regardless of the facts. And yes, some of these inquiries ended with the couple being told gently, or not so gently, to go home and try harder. The priest might offer a blessing, a sermon about love and duty, and a quiet warning. The Lord watches all beds, even in the dark. Not exactly a turn-on. Still, through all this, one truth emerges: medieval people took sex seriously, not just as desire, but as duty. It was bound up in law, faith, and family legacy. And when things didn't go as expected, the consequences weren't just private. They were judged by candlelight, written in ink, and whispered about for generations. So tonight, as your room grows still, and no one's taking notes on your love life, take a moment to be grateful that your relationships aren't subject to ecclesiastical inquiry, that your bedroom isn't a courtroom, and that no one is asking your neighbors to testify about your honeymoon. You wake up on a hay-stuffed mattress in a wooden cottage lit by morning mist and hear the familiar rustle of a neighbor walking past with a basket of laundry balanced on her hip. She's humming as if nothing in the world is strange. But if you ask her about what's proper in the bedroom, or more precisely what's not, she'll tell you with full confidence that some acts will make your hands shrivel, your crops fail, or your goat give sour milk. Welcome to the quirky, tangled world of medieval sexual taboos. Let's be honest, no society is completely free of weird beliefs around intimacy, but the Middle Ages had a particular flair for mixing superstition, shame, and occasional bursts of surprisingly progressive thinking. In your sleepy village, knowledge isn't delivered in science books. It's passed on through grandmothers' parish sermons and traveling merchants who swear they once met a woman whose baby was born with goat eyes. Naturally, everyone believes them. First, let's talk about positions. Yes, even that was regulated. The church explicitly taught that only one position was acceptable: the missionary one, face-to-face man on top. Why? Because it was seen as the natural order, mirroring male dominance and the supposed hierarchy of creation. Everything else, sideways, seated, standing, anything involving furniture or enthusiasm, was discouraged or outright condemned. One clerical guide called these acts bestial mimicry, which, if nothing else, sounds like a great name for a medieval metal band. Historians still argue whether these prohibitions were widely followed or simply scared the more devout. But you can bet they caused plenty of anxiety for newlyweds trying to figure out the logistics without risking eternal damnation. Now, what counted as a major sin versus a whoopsie that depended. Intercourse during menstruation was considered not only a sin, but a health hazard. It was believed to poison crops, warp unborn babies, or infect the man's soul. The logic was hazy, but the panic was real. Similarly, intimacy during daylight hours was frowned upon, especially if birds could see you. Yes, that's a real warning from a 13th century priest. He claimed animals witnessing sinful acts would carry the image with them, causing nature itself to rebel. There were also taboos around times and places. Church altars were strictly off limits for obvious reasons. But some took this further, saying, even within sight of a crucifix was problematic. Some households covered religious images or icons with cloth during marital acts just in case St. Francis didn't want front row seats. And if you lived near a cemetery, forget it. The dead were believed to be extremely judgmental. Medieval people also had firm ideas about what went where and why. Non-procreative acts, even between married couples, were often condemned as sodomy, a term that was far broader back then and included pretty much anything outside the narrowly approved method. In extreme cases, couples were excommunicated, fined, or forced to undergo public penance. Think standing barefoot in church holding a candle while a bishop scowled at you. Definitely a mood killer. And then there were beliefs about what intimacy could cause. Some thought that conceiving a child in certain seasons would influence their personality. Winter babies were said to be cold-hearted. Summer babies impulsive and rash. Conceiving during a thunderstorm, that child might be born with a temper or the ability to speak to snakes. Of course, none of this was based on science, but when your midwife's main source of knowledge is herbal lore and old wives' tales, everything seems plausible. Animals, too, weren't spared from the gossip. It was said that a dog sleeping in the marital bed could cause impotence. Cats, they stole your soul during climax. Chickens were relatively safe unless they crowed during the act. Then it was bad luck for 7 years. And don't even think about doing anything intimate during an eclipse. That was a cosmic no-no, guaranteed to produce a deformed child, or at least a very awkward family meal. People also believed that certain foods before intimacy could curse or bless the event. Beans were a gamble. Some said they encouraged fertility. Others warned they clouded the humors. Garlic was protective, but only if chewed by both partners. Onions, oddly, were said to make you forget your station, which could mean anything from forgetting your chores to committing socially inappropriate acts with the stable hand. And let's not forget the truly niche taboos. One medieval text warned against looking at a mirror right after intimacy, lest your reflection shatter the soul. Another claimed that whispering another person's name during the act would summon demons unless that name was a saint's, in which case it was just confusing. Despite all these restrictions, people still did what people do. But the fear lingered. Fear of divine punishment. Fear of infertility. Fear of being labeled unclean or unnatural. These taboos weren't just private, they were social. You could be shunned, judged, or mocked for breaking them even in the privacy of your own home. And that pressure seeped into the psyche, shaping how people saw themselves, their partners, and their bodies. Yet within the madness, there was a strange consistency. Almost all these taboos pointed to the idea that sex was powerful. Too powerful to be left unchecked. Whether it summoned demons or soured your butter, it had consequences, and controlling it through fear, myth, or prayer was seen as a form of protection. So tonight, as you drift off in a world with fewer rules and significantly less goat-related superstition, be grateful for the freedom to learn, explore, and laugh at the past's peculiar paranoia. And maybe close the curtains, just in case the neighbor's rooster is unusually judgmental. You're sitting in a candlelit chamber, nibbling on a hunk of rye bread, and watching your lord's daughter sneak a folded note into her bodice. She's been exchanging letters with a stable boy, a reckless move, but not unheard of. In the Middle Ages, love wasn't just about passion. It was a minefield of power, piety, and paperwork. That's right. Forbidden love came with consequences, especially when it crossed class lines or challenged the church's very specific expectations. The idea of love for love's sake wasn't exactly mainstream. Marriages, particularly among the nobility, were political tools. They secured alliances, transferred property, and ensured dynastic continuity. A romantic spark. That was a nice bonus if you were lucky. But for most, love was something you discovered or didn't after the wedding. Yet people still fell in love in all the wrong ways. A blacksmith's apprentice might pine for a merchant's daughter. A cloistered nun might harbor feelings for the handsome priest delivering morning mass. And when these feelings were acted upon, the fallout could be dramatic public and weirdly theatrical. Historians still argue whether such forbidden romances were common or just popular story material, but medieval literature is absolutely packed with them. Tristan and Isolde, Lancelot and Guinevere, even the Romance of the Rose, a racy allegory about seduction hidden inside a garden. These tales weren't just entertainment. They were cautionary, aspirational, and sometimes scandalously sympathetic to the rule breakers. Take, for example, the case of Abelard and Heloise Scholar and student clergyman and young noblewoman. Their secret affair and tragic fallout, he was castrated, she was sent to a convent, were the stuff of legend. But their letters filled with longing and regret survived, and they show something surprising, a genuine emotional connection, intellectual respect, and heartbreak. In a time when love was rarely private, their private words became public legacy. But not all forbidden love was romantic. Some relationships were born of necessity, isolation, or opportunity. A lady-in-waiting might find herself drawn to another woman in her household. A monk, isolated in silence, might seek comfort in a fellow brother's company. These situations were deeply taboo, and the penalties, if discovered, were severe. Church doctrine was unambiguous. Same-sex intimacy was labeled a grave sin. Theologians wrote lengthy treatises on the unnaturalness of such acts, often borrowing language from Roman law and layering it with fire and brimstone flair. Accused individuals might face flogging, imprisonment, or exile. In some regions, repeat offenders could be burned at the stake, not always for the act itself, but for defying church authority. And yet some scholars suggest the rules were enforced unevenly. Monasteries, for example, were spaces where emotional bonds often grew intense. Letters between monks sometimes blur the lines between friendship and romance. Were they coded confessions? Innocent affection? Historians still argue whether these documents reveal hidden queer histories or simply reflect different cultural norms around male intimacy. Outside of same-sex relationships, forbidden love also included consanguinity, that is, falling for someone too closely related. The church had strict rules about who could marry whom. Initially, you couldn't marry anyone within 7 degrees of kinship. That's basically half the village. Even third or fourth cousins were off limits without papal dispensation. And tracing those relationships required serious math. Got a crush on your father's cousin's son's wife's niece. Better check the family tree twice. These rules weren't just about purity. They were about inheritance, keeping property in the right hands, avoiding alliances that might consolidate too much power. So, when love threatened those plans, it wasn't just frowned upon, it was forcibly untangled. Still, people tried. Secret marriages happened. Elopements occurred. Some couples went to great lengths to create paper trails that justified their union, falsifying birth records, bribing priests, or getting married in faraway towns under assumed names. And when they got caught, the punishment might be annulment, excommunication, or for the especially bold public humiliation. And then there were clerical romances. Priests were supposed to be celibate, monks and nuns too, but not all followed the rules. Some kept mistresses, even children. The church condemned this fiercely, but enforcement was spotty. In some regions, communities turned a blind eye, so long as the priests still performed baptisms and funerals on time. There's even evidence of clandestine marriages performed by rebellious clergy. These were real marriages in the eyes of God and the couple, but illegal without a bishop's approval. The church despised them. So did angry fathers, but lovers in love. They didn't always wait for permission. Poets romanticized these transgressions. They framed forbidden love as noble suffering, as passion too intense to be restrained. They sang of lovers who met at midnight, exchanged rings in secret chapels, and faced exile with hands still clasped. Were they exaggerating? Probably. But they captured something real, that in a world of rules and rigidity, love still found cracks to slip through. So tonight, as your breath slows and your dreams begin to stir, think of those lovers huddled under castle eaves, passing notes through cracks in the stone, of whispered promises made behind convent doors, of the risk, the hope, and the occasional goat disguised as a chaperone. Forbidden love, after all, isn't just about breaking rules. It's about daring to feel in a world that tells you not to. You're squinting in the smoky glow of a village hearth as an old woman, wrapped in wool and smelling faintly of rosemary and damp books, reaches into a dusty trunk. She pulls out a thin bundle of parchment, each page covered in looping script, strange symbols, and little illustrations of herbs, stars, and the occasional, very surprised-looking goose. No, this isn't a spell book. Not exactly. It's a grimoire of love magic. And yes, it includes instructions for how to make someone fall for you using nothing but wine fingernail clippings and weirdly roasted onion skins. Welcome to the medieval world of magical seduction, where desire could be summoned, manipulated, or destroyed with the right combination of timing, ritual, and extremely questionable ingredients. The Middle Ages were full of contradictions. The church preached chastity and restraint, but villagers still whispered to hedge witches and cunning folk for potions to win over a sweetheart, or less nobly, to sway someone who really wasn't interested. And while most of this magic was illegal, immoral, or both, it never stopped being popular. After all, what's a little heresy when your crush won't look your way? Historians still argue whether love magic was mostly metaphor, just folk rituals with emotional power, or genuinely believed to wield supernatural effects. But the manuals, court records, and confessions left behind show that plenty of people took it very seriously. There were two types of love magic attraction spells and repulsion curses. You either wanted someone to love you, or to stop loving someone else, or occasionally to become so obsessed with you they forgot how to speak in public. Medieval people didn't mess around. Let's start with the potions. Love filters could be simple: a cup of wine with powdered rose petals and honey, or horrifyingly elaborate wine mixed with menstrual blood, dried frogs, and ash from a church candle. Yes, some recipes were disturbingly unhygienic, but they reflected the idea that love, like alchemy, required transformation risk and a pinch of madness. Other charms involved sympathetic magic, the idea that objects connected to a person could influence them from afar. Hair nails, clothing, anything personal could be used. One popular trick was to sew a lover's name into a piece of linen and wear it close to the heart for 7 nights under a waxing moon. Another involved writing their name backward on an egg, then burying it at a crossroads while whispering a rhyme. Eggs were a recurring theme. So were crossroads. And whispering. Lots of whispering. If you wanted things to go a bit more forcefully, you could try a binding spell. These were used to make someone physically crave you. Some involved knots, twisting red cords, while chanting phrases in Latin, or in some cases, absolute gibberish that sounded magical. Others called for carving symbols into candles, lighting them at night, and letting them burn down while imagining your target in vivid detail. Fire desire and wax figurines, it's like an early Gothic Tinder. And it wasn't just women doing this. Men sought magical help too, especially if they felt rejected, emasculated, or just plain unlucky. One 14th century charm advised bachelors to rub their feet with basil oil, then step into the footprints of the woman they desired. Apparently, this transferred heat and intention through the souls. Less creepy than some methods. More likely to confuse the local cobbler. But there were risks. If caught practicing love magic, you could be accused of sorcery, a crime often tied to heresy. Punishments ranged from penance and public shaming to imprisonment, or in extreme cases, execution. The church wasn't fond of people meddling with free will, especially when romance was involved. One bishop declared that love spells were doors through which demons crawl, giggling into our bedsheets, which, let's admit, would be a terrifying pillowcase design. Despite the danger, people kept trying. And the line between magic and medicine blurred constantly. Some spells were disguised as remedies or folk prayers. Others hid in plain sight blessings that doubled as incantations, charms, stitched into clothing. Prayers repeated under the breath with suspicious specificity. And then there were love curses spells, designed not to attract but to repel. Jilted lovers might hire a local wise woman to cool the heart of their rival. Some used cursed herbs, like henbane or wolfsbane, mixing them into food or drink never recommended. Others invoked saints in bizarrely petty ways, like begging Saint Dymphna to give your ex terrible breath or an itchy foot. It was magical vengeance on a very human scale. Even within the church, not everyone was immune to magical thinking. Monks copied texts filled with protective charms. Nuns wore amulets shaped like hearts or eyes. And though most clergy condemned love magic in theory, in practice, they often treated it like a sin of desperation. Wrong, yes, but understandable. Affairs of the heart, one confessor wrote, turn even the pious into fools. By the late Middle Ages, love magic began merging with courtly rituals. Nobles might exchange rings, enchanted by wandering mystics. Queens commissioned astrologers to select the best night for conception. Kings wore charms under their armor, not just for protection, but to keep their lovers loyal. It wasn't just peasant superstition, it had climbed the social ladder. So tonight, as you nestle into your blankets and the shadows stretch like soft ribbon across the walls, imagine those quiet figures at midnight tying knots, lighting candles, whispering names into the wind. Not out of evil, but out of yearning. Out of hope that maybe, just maybe, the universe was listening and that love like magic could be summoned with the right words at the right time. You're seated in a darkened cathedral, its stone walls echoing with the low hum of chanting. Incense coils through the air like spirit smoke, but you're not here for mass, you're here to confess. And not just any sin. Oh no. Tonight's confession involves the quiet shame of carnal error. Because in the Middle Ages, your local priest didn't just worry about your gossiping or your stolen apples. He wanted to know exactly how, when, and why you'd broken the church's complex and often bizarre rules on sexuality. Welcome to the medieval confession booth, a place where privacy met precision and where your bedroom decisions were evaluated with theological rigor. Let's start with the framework. By the 12th century, the Church had standardized the sacrament of confession. Every Christian was expected to confess at least once a year, especially before Easter. And sexual sins, those topped the list. Not just adultery, mind you, though. That was a whopper. But everything from impure thoughts to improper marital enthusiasm. Historians still argue whether confessions were truly as detailed as the manuals suggest, or whether they were more general in practice. But the guides left behind, called penitentials, tell a fascinating, often eye-watering story. These books were written by clergy for clergy, offering step-by-step instructions on how to question, categorize, and punish a wide variety of sins. One popular 9th century text begins with, "First ask the penitent if he has committed fornication, and with whom woman, man, beast, or inanimate object." You read that right. They were thorough, and the questions didn't stop at "did you?" They went into the how, the when, and the why. Had you sinned with your spouse on a holy day, used a non-approved position, experienced too much pleasure, thought lustful thoughts during prayer? Congratulations, you owed penance. Some questions were oddly specific. One penitential asked whether the man had removed himself before emission for the purpose of avoiding conception. If so, penance. Another asked whether a woman had used herbs or concoctions to prevent the seed from taking root. Again, penance. Even wearing perfume to entice a man to unclean thought could be considered sinful. And don't think being married gave you a free pass. One particularly stern guide insisted that even within marriage, sex should be rare, solemn, and unaccompanied by joy. It suggested couples should only unite for the purpose of procreation, and even then with prayer and sorrow. The ultimate medieval dirty talk was probably something like, "Shall we fulfill our marital duty with remorse and moderate haste?" Confessors were trained to look for signs of indulgence. Too many children, you were blessed. Too few, suspicious. If you had none, you might be questioned about your intent. Were you avoiding God's plan? Were you using potions or spells? Or worse, enjoying the act too much? Punishments varied. A minor offense might earn you a week of bread and water, or several dozen recitations of the Lord's Prayer. But graver sins could mean months of fasting exclusion from communion or pilgrimages to holy sites. In some cases, if the sin involved clerics or religious vows, you could be publicly humiliated or permanently reassigned to another monastery where your eyes may wander less. Women, too, were expected to confess with excruciating honesty. Midwives were interrogated about whether they'd ever helped prevent a pregnancy or deliver a child in secret. Wives were asked whether they'd ever refused their husbands out of laziness or sought excessive pleasure. One female penitent was reportedly made to crawl the length of the church nave after confessing to wearing silk stockings to attract attention. And this wasn't even during a service, just a regular Tuesday. But not all confessors were harsh. Some showed compassion, especially toward those clearly struggling with guilt or confusion. They offered advice, reassurance, and occasionally actual counseling about relationships. A few monks even wrote pastoral letters acknowledging the difficulty of celibacy, the complexity of desire, and the basic human need for connection. Of course, there were also fake confessors, quacks, who traveled between villages offering absolution in exchange for coins or favors. They sometimes gave hilariously light penance in return for scandalous confessions, 3 Hail Marys, and a goose feather, and you're forgiven. These frauds infuriated the church, but remained popular, especially among those tired of being grilled like a sinner on a spit. Confession wasn't always private either. In small communities, everyone knew who was going to the priest and when. A sudden visit after market day might suggest something happened behind the apple cart. And while priests were supposed to keep confessions, secret rumors often swirled. Some towns even had nicknames for regular penitents like Twice-a-Week Walter or Marjorie the Murmurer. And yet, despite the awkwardness, confession was deeply embedded in medieval life. It offered a release valve, a moment of honesty in a world governed by strict rules and heavy expectations. It reminded people that they weren't alone in their struggles, and that even the worst slip-up could be forgiven for the right number of prayers and a little public humility. So tonight, as the darkness deepens and no one asks you to list your sins in order of seriousness, be grateful for your peaceful penance-free pillow. And remember that in another time, someone might have spent their Thursday night confessing to St. Jerome's assistant that they once looked too long at the baker's apprentice. You awaken to the clanging of bells from the monastery down the lane, the rhythmic tolling reminding every soul in town that today is a holy day. But you've already been up for hours. Your spouse insisted on avoiding eye contact during breakfast, muttering something about St. Agnes and divine judgment. Why? Because in the Middle Ages, certain days, seasons, and celestial signs were believed to have extraordinary influence over your love life. Yes, timing was everything, and not just for planting crops or avoiding the plague. Medieval people believed there were right and wrong times to get frisky, fall in love, or even think impure thoughts. Let's start with the liturgical calendar. As we've seen before, the church laid down rules about when sex was forbidden. But beyond those general prohibitions, entire seasons were thought to affect passion. Lent, for example, was a time of denial and purification. Couples were expected to abstain sometimes for 40 full days. Advent, too, was a season of preparation. Then there were Rogation Days, Ember Days, and a dozen other feast-linked occasions during which carnal acts were frowned upon. Historians still argue whether these restrictions were widely obeyed or quietly ignored. Certainly many people tried to follow the rules. Some kept elaborate calendars, not just for prayer, but for tracking their approved windows. One particularly devout household supposedly marked a wooden beam above their bed, with chalk red lines for no green lines for go. Not exactly subtle, but practical. Then there were the celestial factors. Medieval astrology wasn't a novelty, it was mainstream science. Physicians consulted the stars before surgeries. Farmers planted by moon phase, and lovers. They scheduled intimacy based on the movement of the planets. If Venus was in the house of Mars, passion was said to burn too hot, leading to arguments or even spiritual harm. Better to wait until Venus aligned with Jupiter for a more harmonious vibe. Yes, medieval astrology had big Mercury retrograde energy. Books called Lunaria helped couples track the moon's position to determine fertility and temperament. Conceiving under a waxing moon might bring a healthy child, while a waning moon risked weakness or misfortune. Some guides even suggested specific hours of the day for procreation, usually tied to which archangel was said to be watching at the time. Which sounds romantic, until you realize you're waiting for Gabriel's hour while trying not to sneeze on your candle. Seasons mattered too. Spring was associated with rebirth and energy, fertile both literally and metaphorically. Summer brought risk, though some believed children conceived in summer would be too fiery, too impulsive. Autumn, a mixed bag. Winter cold, unpredictable, potentially cursed. One 14th century German text warns that winter conceptions lead to brooding spirits and thin blood, not ideal. Of course, none of this stopped people from doing what people do, but it did influence how they felt about the outcomes. A child born on the wrong day might be feared as unlucky or melancholic. A marriage that began under the wrong sign might be blamed for decades of disharmony. It wasn't just poor choices, it was the stars. And if you were truly unlucky, you might be born on a forbidden day. Fridays especially. Good Friday were considered terrible for both intimacy and birth. Monday was marginal, too close to the Sabbath. Tuesdays were chaotic. Wednesday was fine. Thursday, better. But Saturday, oddly, was both quietly approved and possibly heretical, depending on whom you asked. One wildly specific tradition in parts of France declared that intimacy during a thunderstorm risked calling down demonic forces. Another warned that if lightning struck nearby while you were a mid-activity, the child would be born with red eyes and an aversion to prayer. Even the weather had opinions. Want to spice things up? Some believed that certain cosmic events enhanced passion. A bright comet was thought to stir the blood. A meteor shower could increase wanton dreams. Eclipses were more controversial. Some thought they made people frenzied and bold, while others swore they caused impotence. In other words, if the sky was doing something dramatic, expect your bedroom to follow suit. But not all timing rules came from fear. There were folk traditions meant to bless romantic encounters. For example, some couples believed that making love on May Day morning, just as the sun rose, would ensure a fertile year and strengthen the bond between them. Others waited for Beltane, a pagan-rooted holiday celebrated with bonfires and, let's say, enthusiastic dancing. Even after the church tried to suppress these festivals, their popularity endured, likely because they offered something the other 300-plus no-touch days didn't permission. In towns where older customs survived, people whispered about which saints were sympathetic. Saint Valentine, of course, was invoked for lovers, but also Saint Agnes, Saint Dwynwen, and even Saint Margaret, depending on the region. Some households hung herbs by the door: lavender for love, rue for chastity, mugwort for, honestly, no one really knew, but it smelled mystical. They didn't just schedule their feelings, they tried to engineer them. Even dreams were timed. Some believed that sleeping on certain days would produce visions of one's future lover. Sunday nights were ideal, Thursdays risky. If you dreamt of water, it meant love. If you dreamt of fire desire, if you dreamt of bread, well, maybe have a snack before bed next time. So tonight, as your head nestles into the pillow and the night sky stretches far above you, consider this: in a world ruled by rules, rituals, and rhythms, even love was on a clock. You weren't just choosing when to be close. You were listening to the stars, the saints, and your own grandmother's calendar. And somehow, against all odds, the human heart still found time to skip a beat. You're strolling down a narrow alley, the kind that snakes behind the cathedral and between the bathhouse and the alewife's shop. It's twilight, and behind closed shutters, you can hear laughter, low rhythmic and unmistakably adult. You've just wandered near one of the most controversial yet undeniably central parts of medieval society, the brothel. Yes, despite centuries of church preaching and moral posturing, medieval towns had entire districts quietly, sometimes loudly dedicated to the world's oldest profession. And while the line between sin and service was always blurry, brothels weren't hidden dens of debauchery. Often, they were licensed, regulated, and in some cases funded by the very authorities who preached against them. Let's peel back the curtain on this strange, paradoxical world. Medieval brothels came in many forms. Some were elegant, multi-story houses staffed by seasoned workers who wore fine fabrics and knew how to pour wine just right. Others were dingy back rooms in inns filled with straw and the faint scent of regret. But all operated in an uneasy truce between dire necessity and official denial. Historians still argue whether the majority of brothels were tolerated out of pragmatism or quietly encouraged as moral safety valves. In cities like Paris, London, and Florence, municipal records show that brothels were taxed, their madams licensed, and their workers even provided with certain legal protections. A 14th century law in Avignon required brothels to fly a red banner because apparently subtlety was not a medieval strength. You'd think this open acceptance would mean society viewed sex work with neutrality. But no, it was tangled in stigma and contradiction. Brothel workers were considered impure, sinful, and socially dead. They were often barred from marrying owning land or wearing certain colors like scarlet, which was ironically also used to mark elite courtesans. Many were forced into the trade through poverty, abandonment, or orphanhood. And yet at the same time, they were a key part of the city's economy. The church officially condemned prostitution, of course. Theologians wrote long-winded treatises, comparing it to a sewer for sin or a necessary evil to protect the innocent. One even likened brothels to public latrines, disgusting but preferable to public defecation. Comforting. And yet some church leaders quietly supported licensed brothels, arguing that regulating sin was better than pretending it didn't exist. One bishop in Vienna is rumored to have funded the construction of a brothel near a monastery, citing the preservation of monthly discipline. Whether that's apocryphal or just very on-brand for the 13th century, it reflects a deeper truth: these places existed because people used them regularly. Brothels were sometimes used as quasi-clinics. Midwives and herbalists worked there, tending to women's health in ways society otherwise ignored. Some workers learned medical knowledge, how to soothe infections, apply poultices, or prepare rudimentary contraception, using things like wild carrot seeds, pennyroyal, or vinegar-soaked cloths. Was it effective? Debatable. Was it their only option? Often yes. And here's the truly medieval twist: some brothel workers were trained entertainers. They sang, danced, played music, even recited poetry. In courtly circles, these skills elevated certain women to the role of courtesan, a kind of romantic freelancer who might accompany a nobleman for weeks, acting as companion confidant and very unofficial therapist. Of course, not every story ends in music and moonlight. Life inside the brothel could be brutal. Many workers were exploited unpaid or indebted to madams who acted more like loan sharks. Fines for lateness, gossiping, or smiling too often weren't uncommon, and there was always the threat of disease. Syphilis wasn't widely recognized yet, but gonorrhea and other infections were rampant, and treatments ranged from ineffective herbs to terrifying metal instruments. Still, many towns had a complicated fondness for their red light districts. Local festivals sometimes passed right by them. One chronicle from Bruges describes a town crier inviting all men of decent coin and indecent mind to the brothel quarter after sunset. The event was technically part of a Saints' Day celebration, because nothing says piety like a parade of ale and innuendo. Yet even within this world, rules applied. Brothels were often located outside city walls or near rivers, not just for discretion, but for easy removal if things got out of hand. And workers were expected to observe the same religious fasts and feast day abstinences as everyone else. That meant no business during Lent Advent or any major saint's day, unless, of course, someone paid extra and nobody told the bishop. Interestingly, not all brothel workers saw themselves as damned. Some prayed regularly, gave alms, and hoped for redemption. One famous woman, Mary of Egypt, was a prostitute turned saint. Her story, whether exaggerated or not, inspired countless others to seek spiritual peace. Some brothels even had little shrines where workers lit candles between clients and whispered prayers they didn't dare speak aloud. Eventually, the tide turned. The late Middle Ages saw growing pressure from reformers who wanted to shut brothels down. Moral panic mingled with disease outbreaks, and city officials, now more image-conscious, began to quietly dismantle what they once supported. But the memory lingered. So tonight, as the hush of sleep settles around you, think of those flickering rooms behind the city walls, of laughter, tears, music, and the complicated truth of desire lived on the margins. And whether you see it as sin, survival, or simply another human story, remember that history's most whispered chapters often say the most. You're watching from a shadowy pew as a wedding unfolds in the village chapel. Candles, flickering, veils fluttering, and a suspiciously nervous groom adjusting his belt for the fourth time. The priest raises his hands to bless the union, and the crowd leans in, not just to witness the vows, but to see if the couple actually know what they're getting into. Because in the Middle Ages, a wedding wasn't the end of the love story. It was often the beginning of a long, legally complicated, socially scrutinized, and sometimes utterly baffling chapter involving sex consent and strange rituals. The church took marriage seriously, very seriously. It was one of the 7 sacraments ordained by God and directly tied to the idea of procreation and salvation. But the actual rules around marriage were far more chaotic than you might expect. First off, there was no requirement for witnesses, a priest, or even a ceremony until the 13th century. As long as both parties said, "I take you as my spouse," that was it. Bam, married. Whisper it behind a barn, married. Say it in Latin French, or mime it awkwardly across a fish stall, still married. Historians still argue whether this consensual marriage model was a disaster or a surprisingly modern approach. Either way, it led to a lot of he said, she said confusion. If one partner later denied the vows were exchanged, court cases followed, some of which involved dragging in witnesses who may or may not have seen the couple holding hands near a well 6 years earlier. Eventually, the church cracked down. By the 1200s, it required marriages to be public witnessed and officiated by a priest. But the emphasis remained on consent. If either party didn't agree, the union wasn't valid. Yes, the same church that frowned on lace-up boots and smiling during Lent was surprisingly progressive about mutual agreement. That said, defining consent wasn't always straightforward. In cases where girls were married off at age 12 or boys at 14, there was debate about whether they were old enough to truly understand what they were agreeing to. One court case famously reversed a marriage because the bride had consented under confusion, thinking she was agreeing to borrow a goat. And then there were the tests of consummation. As you'll remember from earlier, because how could you forget, sex was a crucial part of marriage. No consummation, no validity. That led to awkward rituals, where families or priests would literally watch the couple walk into the bedroom, post-wedding, sometimes accompanied by songs, snacks, and encouraging nods. Think of it as a group project nobody wanted to lead. In some regions, a priest would bless the marriage bed. In others, newlyweds had to display the post-nuptial sheets to prove they'd done the deed. And yes, there were entire folk songs devoted to whether the bride sang sweetly the next morning. The Middle Ages were many things, subtle was not one of them. Sex within marriage had its own rule book. As always, it had to be for procreation, not pleasure. Spouses were required to be open to children, even if none arrived. And if a husband refused to fulfill his marital duty, the wife could take him to court. Literally. In one famous case, a man had to stand before a jury of matrons who judged whether his credentials were functional. Spoiler, he failed. Annulment granted. There were also strange rituals meant to ensure fertility. One involved placing a holy relic under the mattress. Another called for the bride to drink milk from a cow that had given birth that spring. If nothing worked, couples might visit a local saint's shrine and sleep on the ground beside it, hoping for divine intervention, or at least a dream with helpful instructions. One surprisingly common belief was that naming your children before conception could invite their soul. Couples would write names on parchment and place it beneath their pillow on their wedding night. If the child was born healthy, the chosen name stuck. If not, well, they tried again. Love, luck, and mild superstition all bundled into one linen sheet. Of course, not all marriages were based on love. Many were arranged, especially among the nobility. Politics, land, and dowries drove the union's not fluttery feelings. But that didn't mean affection couldn't grow. Letters survive of husbands and wives who developed deep bonds over time, even starting as strangers. Others, not so lucky, stayed locked in cold contractual arrangements while secretly longing for someone else. And when love turned to loathing, divorce, as we understand it, today didn't exist. But annulments could be granted under certain conditions: non-consummation forced consent, consanguinity, or spiritual vows. That meant if one partner secretly joined a convent or monastery, the marriage could be undone. It was the medieval equivalent of ghosting, except with tonsure and incense. Wives were expected to obey. Husbands were expected to provide, but both had duties, including the dreaded marital debt. That's right, if one partner wanted intimacy, the other was supposed to oblige, no matter the mood. This obligation went both ways and was surprisingly egalitarian, at least in theory. Reality, of course, varied wildly. So tonight, as the flicker of candlelight dances across your walls, and no one demands a signed sheet as proof of affection, consider the medieval couple starting their life together, under layers of pressure, ritual, and rumor. Their love, like yours, was shaped by the world around them, but also by small, defiant choices made behind closed doors. Choices that whispered, "This is ours, just ours." You're walking down a cobblestone street just before dawn, and you notice a figure slipping into the back entrance of the local apothecary. Nothing too strange, except she's clutching a bundle of dried herbs, a worn velvet pouch, and the kind of look that says, "This conversation never happened." Because in the Middle Ages, when the official advice was just don't, people still turned to folk remedies, secret knowledge, and backdoor solutions to manage their sex lives. Let's talk about contraception and fertility control, a deeply whispered, highly risky, but very real part of medieval experience. Church doctrine was clear: any attempt to block conception was a grave sin, an offense not only against your body, but against God's plan. Sex was meant for procreation. Anything else was dangerous. And yet, human nature, being what it is, pushed back. People didn't always want more children. Sometimes they weren't ready. Sometimes they weren't married. And sometimes, let's face it, they were just practical. So they turned to alternative knowledge, some of it based in ancient texts, some passed down through generations of midwives, herbalists, and cunning folk. These remedies were rarely written down. When they were, they often appeared in coded language, buried inside books about agriculture or saints' lives. Historians still argue whether these practices were effective or more symbolic. But the documentation, spotty as it is, shows a rich if shadowy world of natural contraceptives, withdrawal methods, magical charms, and even proto-condoms made of animal intestines, or linen soaked in herbal infusions. Let's start with the herbs. Some plants were believed to suppress ovulation or interfere with implantation. Silphium, a plant now extinct, was famously used in the Roman world as a contraceptive and was likely still whispered about centuries later. Other contenders included pennyroyal rue wild carrot seeds and juniper berries, all used in tinctures, teas, or poultices. Some were ingested, some were placed in the vagina, and most came with stern warnings. Do not use on holy days, avoid if pregnant, or only mix with water from a sacred well. Withdrawal, though condemned by theologians, was widely practiced. It was seen as a lesser evil than full abstinence, especially within marriage. One penitential text hilariously scolded couples for spilling seed with intention, but acknowledged that the sin is grievous, yet not always avoidable. In other words, even the clergy kind of got it. Then there were amulets and charms. A woman might wear a stone etched with astrological symbols, or a folded parchment containing verses from the Book of Psalms, blessed between womb and tomb, one spell read. Another involved binding a rooster feather with red thread and tying it around the thigh before bed. Was it effective? No idea. Did it help women feel in control of their bodies in a world that rarely gave them that right? Absolutely. Condom-like devices did exist, though they were rare and often reused. Yikes. They were usually made from sheep, gut-tied with ribbon and washed carefully between uses. Not so much for contraception as for protection from disease, especially in urban brothels. A few surviving medical texts mention sheaths for licentious men, and one even includes instructions: boil the bladder of a goat dry and sew with silk. If that doesn't scream romance, I don't know what does. Abortion, of course, was hugely taboo, but still practiced. The church's stance evolved over the centuries at one point, distinguishing between formed and unformed fetuses, a classification drawn from Aristotle no less. Some clerics condemned all abortion as murder. Others debated the timing of ensoulment. Meanwhile, women turned to their community healers, who offered restorative tonics to bring down the moon blood. No one said the A word. Everyone knew what was meant. Punishments for using or providing contraception ranged from confession and penance to, in extreme cases, excommunication or public shaming. Yet these measures didn't stop the practices, they just pushed them underground, where knowledge was passed through coded stories whispered instructions, or embroidered symbols. A plant stitched into a hem, a bracelet with 7 knots, a recipe shared only between sisters. And let's not forget the role of men. They too sought ways to avoid fatherhood, sometimes through charm carrying, sometimes through superstition. One English farmer was said to sleep with a smooth stone under his pillow to cool the loins. Others wore belts with religious relics sewn inside, hoping divine protection would equal divine prevention. It's not how any of this works, obviously, but desperation leads to creativity. Interestingly, not all church figures were totally anti-prevention. A few sympathetic priests turned a blind eye when couples confessed using timing or herbal drinks. One even wrote, "Better to love in caution than to breed in bitterness." It wasn't doctrine, but it was human. By the late Middle Ages, knowledge around fertility began to shift again, influenced by translations of Arabic medical texts and renewed interest in anatomy. But the core tension remained desire for control in a system that offered none. So tonight, as you settle into your warm bed, maybe reflect on the quiet courage of those who tried to steer their own futures with roots recipes and a healthy dose of whispered wisdom. In a world where your choices were limited and your body not quite your own, they found ways, messy, imperfect, and hidden, to say, "This part of me I decide." You stir in your sleep, caught in that dreamy limbo where time feels like candle wax slowly melting. Somewhere in the mist, a bell tolls, and you find yourself in a peculiar courtroom, not one of justice, but of scandal. The air is thick with parchment and perfume. A clerk leans in and says, "Today's hearing, marital misconduct, unusual cravings, and one case of excessive singing after dark." Because, believe it or not, the church courts and moral enforcers of the Middle Ages were very interested in your sex life. Let's talk about how intimate behavior, whether whispered in bedrooms or shouted across markets, could become a public matter, scrutinized not just by priests, but by bureaucrats, nosy neighbors, and the occasional archbishop with a flair for drama. By the 13th century, ecclesiastical courts had evolved into powerful institutions that regulated marriage sexuality and moral conduct across Europe. If you committed adultery, married improperly, refused to fulfill your marital duties, or were caught living with someone as if wed, you could be summoned. And when the church called you showed up. Historians still argue whether these courts aim to truly reform behavior or simply assert clerical authority. But the records they left behind are extensive and weirdly fascinating. Thousands of cases documenting everything from fornication to incest to lewd dancing survive in brittle Latin script. Some are tragic, some are absurd, some sound like bad sitcoms. Take, for example, the case of Martha of Lincoln, who was fined for climbing out the window of her betrothed's room at dawn while laughing. The charge, scandalous cohabitation. Another man was excommunicated after refusing to confess that his wife snored in an unladylike fashion, which allegedly tempted him to sin elsewhere. No word on whether she got a rebuttal. Confessors, too, played a role in enforcement. If someone admitted a serious sin, say adultery or sodomy, the priest might refer them to the bishop's court. There they'd undergo interrogation, public penance, or in some cases be forced to wear a shame garment, a tunic painted with symbolic flames chains, or if the offense was really juicy, tiny devils poking at tender spots. Medieval fashion was not subtle. Public penance was a big deal. Sinners might be made to walk barefoot through town carrying candles. Some wore placards announcing their sins. Others had to kneel at church doors during Mass, while townsfolk walked past whispering prayers or insults. If you ever dreamed of being the main character in your own slow-motion scandal scene, this was it. There were also morality patrols. In some cities, officials called syndics wardens or morality officers would roam the streets at night checking for improper behavior. Couples caught embracing too passionately, dancing too closely, or loitering near bathhouses after curfew could be questioned. If found guilty, they were fined, flogged, or made to recite psalms under supervision. A few cities even imposed bedtime bells, not for safety, but to encourage people to go home and sin privately. The brothel workers we met earlier were also frequently dragged into court, not just for working, but for working on Sundays or refusing to close during Lent. One poor woman was fined for laughing inappropriately while wearing yellow, a color associated with lust. Her defense: the sun was out, case dismissed. Even married couples weren't safe. Spouses could sue each other for non-performance excessive jealousy or cruelty of the tongue. In one famous case, a wife accused her husband of neglecting her for 3 months. Her evidence: she'd place small threads between the bed sheets each night to see if they were disturbed. Medieval intimacy had receipts. Sometimes people brought charges out of revenge. A spurned lover might accuse their ex of sorcery, unnatural acts, or breaking a secret vow. One 15th century woman claimed her former suitor had promised marriage in exchange for 6 months of favor, then married someone else. She brought the case before the archbishop, who ruled in her favor and fined the man 4 sheep. Justice in fleece form. And yes, there were queer cases too. Although heavily condemned, same-sex relationships did surface in court records. Usually charged under the umbrella of sodomy, these trials were often vague-coded or described with euphemisms like unchaste familiarity. Punishments ranged from public penance to exile, but the rarity of actual prosecutions suggests enforcement was inconsistent depending on region, mood, and how public the behavior had been. Not all outcomes were bleak. Some courts showed compassion, especially toward women, or those genuinely penitent. A pregnant woman, abandoned by her lover, might receive protection. A repentant man could have his sentence reduced if he donated to a monastery or paid for candles. Justice wasn't always blind, but it was occasionally generous. Still, the lesson was clear. Your private life was never entirely private. At any moment, love lust, or one wrong smirk, could land you in front of a robed panel with quills, scrolls, and very little patience. So tonight, as you sink deeper beneath your blanket and feel the soft hush of solitude, be grateful for the silence, for the freedom to be yourself, without fear of candlelit judgment, and for the sheer relief that your neighbors can't drag you to court for humming too suggestively near the cheese stall. You blink slowly, tucked into the calm hush of twilight, and hear the distant toll of bells, soft measured and fading. Somewhere beyond the veil of sleep, the medieval world is packing up its scandalous scrolls, folding its relic-laced bedding, and quietly extinguishing its wax-dripped torches. Tonight, as our strange and sleepy journey ends, we descend into the most curious chamber of all the collective imagination of the past, where myths, warnings, and wildly wrong medical theories shaped everything people believed about sex. By the end of the Middle Ages, sex had been so twisted through doctrine, folklore, and medicine that it barely resembled anything we'd recognize today. It was not just a physical act, it was a metaphysical risk, a social negotiation, and an ongoing battlefield of the soul. Let's start with the physicians. While some medieval thinkers, like the scholars of Salerno or Avicenna's followers, tried to ground sexuality in anatomy and humor theory, the results were often a mix of the insightful and the absurd. For instance, it was widely believed that women had to experience pleasure in order to conceive. The female orgasm wasn't a dirty secret, it was a requirement for fertility, progressive almost, except this was also used to accuse barren women of being frigid or impure. And then there was seed theory. Many believed men and women both contributed seeds during intercourse, and a child's characteristics depended on which seed was stronger or which partner enjoyed it more. One 15th century text warned that if a woman climaxed after the man, her seed would spoil the child's nature, leading to daughters with strong wills or sons with female softness. Because clearly, that's how science works. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were sincerely held or just repeated out of tradition. But they shaped everything from marital advice to court rulings to midwifery practices. When doctors wrote about sex, they didn't just describe organs, they described morality, temperament, and even planetary influence. Mercury, for instance, governed lustful intellect. Mars ruled passion. If your birth chart was wrong, you might be more prone to sinful urges. Sorry, Pisces. Religious visions added their own flair. Some mystics described being tormented by demons wielding phallic serpents or cold winds of temptation. Others, like St. Hildegard of Bingen, interpreted sexuality as part of divine balance, natural, but dangerous when misused. She even described the act in glowing metaphors of rivers, and light profoundly poetic, and deeply uncomfortable if read aloud at family dinners. Meanwhile, folklore filled the gaps science couldn't explain. Miscarriages were blamed on bad dreams, wandering spirits, or sleeping in the wrong direction. Impotence could result from evil eye curses or spiteful witches who tied knots in your bed sheets. And unwanted desire, easily cured by rubbing crushed snails on your chest while reciting Psalm 51 backwards. Honestly, modern dating apps should come with that feature. Then there were the punishments in the afterlife. Medieval art is rich with hellscapes where lustful souls suffer ironic fates, eternally chased by flaming genitals, pecked by beak-faced demons, or forced to bathe in rivers of boiling passion. One manuscript shows a man being spanked by a devil with a fish. The symbolism is unclear. The discomfort, universal. And yet within all this fear and shame, there was also a strange kind of wonder. People still wrote love poems, painted naked saints with blushing cheeks, whispered stories of star-crossed lovers turned into birds or flowers. Even in the darkest times, the spark of curiosity, the need to understand ourselves and our desire never quite went out. So tonight, as your breath slows and the glow from your bedside lamp fades, let's honor the awkward, beautiful truth that people in the Middle Ages were just like us, confused, curious, sometimes wildly wrong, but always deep down, trying to make sense of love, of longing, and of the complicated dance between body and soul. And if nothing else, be thankful you didn't have to drink powdered beetles to improve your warmth of affection, or explain your birth chart to a goat-herding inquisitor, or confess to a friar that you dreamt about your neighbor's elbows. You survived, you listened, and you made it all the way through. The air is still now. No more clanging bells, no rustle of parchment, no judgmental friars peering through confession screens, just the soft thrum of your breath and the quiet tap of time flowing forward. You've wandered far tonight through candlelit brothels, whispered spells, awkward marriage beds, and the strange corridors of medieval minds. You've peered behind convent doors, tiptoed through moral courts, and laughed gently at the missteps of 1,000 yesterdays. And in doing so, you've seen something essential, that even the weirdest, most bewildering beliefs come from a place of longing to love, to be loved, to feel some agency over the chaos of life. It's a little comforting, isn't it? That even with saints, stars, and sinners looming overhead, people still tried. They tried to make sense of their hearts, tried to navigate the tangled rules, tried above all to find connection, to find meaning in a kiss, a glance, a vow murmured in the dark. So let all that weight lift now. Let it float off with the smoke from the last candle in the last brothel, in the last medieval village tucked in your mind. You're not there anymore. You're here safe warm, held in the hush of now. Your pillow cradles you like the softest chapel stone. The quiet hum of sleep beckons like a far-off choir. And nothing, no bishop, no spellbook, no fish-wielding demon is coming to ask what's on your mind. Close your eyes. Drift deeper. You've made it through the strangest night in history.